Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to gently lead you into the hushed corners of history, to a time when the rhythms of life were dictated by the rising and setting sun, and the mysteries of womanhood unfolded far from the pages of books or the gaze of physicians. A time when women carried the weight of creation in silence, through moonblood and motherhood, guided only by whispers of old wisdom and the steady hands of midwives. This is the story of how women navigated pregnancy, periods, and birth in the medieval world, not with science as we know it, but with herbs, charms, customs, and courage. So, make yourself comfortable, perhaps pull a warm blanket close, soften the lights, and let the gentle winds of the past lull you into stillness. Now let us begin. In the stillness of a dimly lit stone chamber, nestled at the edge of a quiet village, a young woman named Alice once sat by a hearth's faint glow, her fingers working coarse linen thread into the hem of a woolen smock. Outside, the wind played its low song through the thatched rooftops, and beyond the veil of cold night, life in the 14th century beat on in slow, deliberate rhythm. The fire cracked softly, the scent of dried lavender wafting from the rush-strewn floor. It was winter, and the world moved slower now. Alice, like many women of her time, lived surrounded by women, her mother, her mother's sister, and 2 neighbour wives, and through their voices, she first learned about the hidden rites of womanhood. There were no books in their home, no physicians save the far-off learned men who dealt in leech and Latin, but there was knowledge passed down from hand to hand in careful murmurs and knowing glances. When Alice bled for the first time, her mother knew without words. She had seen the signs. A sudden quietness in her daughter's days, the way she lingered by the fire, the half-glances at the washing basin. There was no celebration, no fear, only a gentle nod and a steaming cup of tea brewed from lady's mantle and yarrow. In the corner of the room, an elder woman quietly murmured blessings into a carved wooden bead and slid it into a pouch to tie around Alice's waist. In medieval times, menstruation was a private thing, a monthly visitor that brought discomfort, inconvenience, and a strange, unspoken power. Women used cloth rags, folded many times, held in place by linen belts or strings. These were boiled clean when the bleeding passed and laid out to dry behind the house, where no man's eyes would wander. And still, even the drying cloths spoke of life's hidden design, a red mark upon the rhythm of the moon. There were herbs to ease the cramps, meadowsweet, mugwort, and sometimes a bit of ale warmed by the hearth. Some women tied charms of hawthorn near bedpost, believing it kept away evil humours. Others whispered prayers to St. Margaret or the Virgin Mary, asking for mercy during their days of pain. It was a mixture of belief and practice, instinct and law. Alice grew into her cycles with quiet dignity. There were times when the pain made her press her forehead to the cool stone wall and breathe through clenched teeth, and times when the flow was so light it passed without trouble. But she was never alone. The women around her understood. They shared warm compresses, handed her sprigs of dried mint, and let her rest when the cramps grew too strong. Then came the day when her courses did not arrive. At first it passed unnoticed. A missed cycle was not uncommon. Changes in weather, illness, or a heavy harvest season could shift the balance. But when a second month came and went, the women began to look at her differently. Her mother's eyes lingered on her longer. Her aunt offered her sweeter broth than usual, and a neighbour brought a carved wooden figurine of a fertility goddess worn smooth from many hands. Alice had not been with a man, and yet stories abounded of saints and sinners alike who'd carried life through unknown means. But this was no miracle. In time it became clear. Her belly grew firm, her skin changed, and she tired more quickly than before. She did not weep. She simply sat by the fire and whispered old prayers, her fingers tracing the threads of her smock. Pregnancy in the medieval world was a mystery cloaked in reverence and fear. There were no tests, no charts, only the slow unfolding of signs, a missed bleeding, a darkening of the nipples, a fluttering movement in the belly known as quickening. Women relied on observation, intuition, and the guidance of elder midwives. The moment the midwife declared that life had stirred within, it was treated as truth. Alice was assigned an older woman named Isabel, a midwife who had birthed over 30 children, her hands lined with age and scented faintly of sage. Isabel was not a healer by trade, but a keeper of birth. She brought with her a pouch of dried herbs, a polished birthing stone, and a collection of linen cloths kept sealed in beeswax to guard against dampness. She sat with Ailís often, telling stories in her gravelly voice, stories of easy births and difficult ones, of women who sang through the pain and those who bit on leather straps to stay silent. During the early months, Ailís was given food rich in warmth, thick broths, poached eggs, barley stews laced with cinnamon and cloves. Cold foods like eel or fresh apples were avoided. It was believed they might chill the womb or harden the child. She was also told to avoid heavy lifting, loud noises, and sudden fright. The babe inside, Isabel would say, hears more than we know. And when sleep came, Ailís dreamed of water, slow, winding streams and quiet lakes. Perhaps her body, like the earth itself, knew the tides were turning. There was no public acknowledgement of her state. It would not be spoken of until much later. To name a pregnancy too early was to risk drawing misfortune. Instead, the women of the house worked around her, gently adjusting their chores to lighten her burden, wrapping her in soft wool when the air turned cold, and rubbing her feet with goose fat to ease the swelling. So the months moved on, and Ailís waited, her hands still threading linen by the fire, the quiet ache of the unknown resting in her bones. Outside, the snows began to melt, and within her something ancient stirred. Not just life, but the weight of all the women who had come before. The days grew longer as spring unfolded, and with it the world outside Ailís's small home stirred into motion once again. Lambs bleated faintly from the hills, the village well no longer froze overnight, and the scent of damp earth returned to the wind. Yet inside, all remained hushed. For Ailís, time no longer moved by the sun or the seasons, but by the quiet rhythms of her changing body. Each morning she would sit near the window, where a sliver of light crept through the wooden shutters. Her hands, once so nimble with needle and thread, now trembled slightly. There were days when her stomach churned before the dawn, forcing her to lean over a clay basin until the queasiness passed. The women called it morning illness, though it came at all hours. Isabel prepared tinctures of ginger root and dried fennel, wrapped in cheesecloth and boiled until the scent filled the room. Ailís drank it slowly, letting the warmth settle her belly. There was no mention of trimesters, no counting of weeks, only observation. The women would glance at her belly, feel for changes, and sometimes press their ears against her abdomen, listening for some whisper of life within. They spoke of quickening with great reverence, that moment when the child first made itself known. Until then, there was an unspoken fear that the pregnancy might vanish like a shadow at dusk, leaving only silence behind. Ailís began to sense small flutterings by the fifth moon, light taps like a bird beneath her skin. She said nothing at first, unsure whether it was real, but when Isabel pressed her ear low against her stomach and smiled without words, Ailís knew it was not imagination. The quickening had come, and with it a kind of relief. The child was alive. Now the preparations began in earnest. Bundles of cloth were brought from neighbouring homes, swaddling linens, woolen wraps and old birthing sheets that had seen many deliveries. Everything was scrubbed in ash and hot water, then hung high in the attic to dry. Midwives believed a clean birth required not only clean hands, but clean spirits. So incense was burned and prayers were murmured. Saint Margaret, patroness of childbirth, was invoked daily. A tiny carving of her likeness was hung above Ailís's bed, a woman stepping out of a dragon's mouth, whole and unscathed. Ailís was instructed to rest often, though rest was uneasy. Her back ached from the weight of her growing womb, and her feet swelled at dusk, leaving her slippers tight. At night, the women rubbed her legs with warm lavender oil, believing it would draw away the heaviness. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of water and wind, of doorways she could not pass through and rooms without windows. She missed walking through the fields. Once, Ailís had run barefoot across the soft green of early spring, her skirts gathered above her knees, chasing after geese with her cousins. Now she moved slowly, her steps deliberate. She wore a cord belt loosened each week and a linen underdress that had belonged to her mother during her own last pregnancy. It bore faint stains she did not ask about. There were whispers too, of course. The village, ever curious, had begun to wonder. no man had come forward, and Ailís had spoken no name. In other times, this might have stirred trouble, but her mother, known for her healing hands, held quiet sway in the community. The priest, a kindly man with crooked teeth and poor vision, simply nodded when he passed by. "God's work is mysterious," he said once, without being asked. Still, the silence was heavy. Not shameful exactly, more like something sacred that could not be named. Ailís remained indoors more often now. When she did venture out, she wore a heavier cloak and kept her eyes low, though her back straightened with subtle pride. Her belly told a story none dared speak aloud. Isabel began teaching her the things a mother must know, not through instruction, but through tales. "Your great-grandmother once birthed twins in a storm," she said one evening, grinding dried nettle with her stone pestle. No midwife could reach her. She did it alone, with only a candle and the Virgin's name on her lips. She told of herbs used to ease labour, tansy, rue and raspberry leaf. "Not too much," she warned. "Some are too strong and the womb must not be rushed." She spoke also of dangers, breech births, slow births and the worst, when a child came too early. These stories were shared not to frighten, but to prepare. Every woman knew someone who had laboured too long, someone who had bled too much, someone who had never risen from the birthing bed. And yet, each story was told with a kind of reverent acceptance, like rain that falls in spring, whether wished for or not. The hearth became the centre of all things. It was where broth simmered, herbs dried, and tales unfurled like threads. Ailís would sit close, her hands cradling her belly, and listen. Sometimes she would ask quiet questions. "Will it hurt?" she once whispered, not quite looking at anyone. Isabel only nodded. "Yes," she said, "but you are not the first, and you will not be the last. The pain comes, and then it goes, and in between you bring the world forth." No one spoke of doctors. Physicians were rare in the countryside, and their methods, bloodletting, purging, use of mercury, were considered dangerous for childbirth. Midwives were trusted instead, though some feared them for their knowledge. Too skilled a woman might be accused of witchcraft. Yet Isabel moved without fear, for she had birthed the priest's own sister's children, and her place was secure. As the 6th moon came, Ailís's appetite grew. She craved strange combinations: dried cherries in salt broth, goat cheese with honey, roasted garlic by the handful. The women did not question her. They fed her what she wanted, believing cravings were messages from the child. "Give the babe what it asks for," said her aunt, setting a jar of pickled plums before her, "else it will come out hungry." And always there was the waiting. Each passing day felt like the drawing back of a curtain, revealing just a little more of the unknown. Ailís often sat in the garden now, wrapped in her cloak, watching the sun rise over the hills. She would press her hand to her belly and speak softly, though no one knew what she said. Perhaps they were names, perhaps only dreams. The other women gave her space, moving around her in gentle silence, as though they too could hear something stirring beneath the soil, something that could not be hurried nor delayed. And so spring ripened, the fields turned green, and the sound of bees returned to the air. But inside that stone cottage, time moved differently, slow, tender, and full of breath. The child turned within her. Ailís, though quiet, was no longer the same. She was becoming something new, not just a mother, but a bearer of ancient knowledge, passed not through books or scrolls, but through the body, the blood, and the sacred silence of women. By the 7th moon, the rhythm of Ailís's days had narrowed to a simple cycle, waking with the light, sitting quietly by the fire, and resting when her limbs grew heavy. Her body was no longer her own. It had become a vessel, a cradle shaped by time and guided by instinct. The women of the household had long since adjusted to the unspoken understanding that everything now moved around Ailís. Meals were timed by her hunger, tasks halted for her comfort, and when she needed silence, even the spinning wheels paused. She no longer fetched water from the well. That duty now fell to her younger cousin, who carried the wooden bucket with both hands, splashing it on the worn stone path. Ailís would watch her from the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame, the spring air brushing across her face. Though she said little, the world within her was growing louder, the occasional jab of an elbow beneath her ribs, the sudden rolls that startled her into laughter or stillness. These movements, once strange, had become part of her. On clear days, she ventured to the edge of the woods, never alone. Always one of the women walked beside her, carrying a satchel of dried herbs and a length of cloth in case she tired. The forest floor was carpeted with wild thyme and violets, and the scent of damp bark mixed with the faint sweetness of blossoms. They spoke little on these walks. There was no need. The woods, like the womb, were quiet places, full of growing things, unseen but constant. The villagers had begun leaving small offerings outside the door, sprigs of rosemary, folded linen squares, bits of wool. No one spoke of it openly, but the unspoken customs of birth were known. A safe delivery was not guaranteed, and so every small act, every herb, every whispered prayer became a ward against misfortune. Some believed in charms, others in saints. All believed in the power of community, in the shared hope that a new life might pass safely into the world. Inside the house, preparations continued. The birthing stool, a three-legged wooden seat with a crescent-shaped cutout, was brought down from the loft. It had been used by Aelis's grandmother and her grandmother before that. The seat was rubbed with beeswax and blessed with frankincense smoke. A clean bed was made in the corner near the hearth, layered with straw, linen, and wool. It was not for sleeping, it was for labour, a place soft enough to support her, yet strong enough to bear her weight. Isabel began visiting more often now, her sharp eyes scanning Aelis's face and fingers. "Your hands swell more," she observed one morning, gently pressing her thumb into Aelis's wrist. "The child is growing strong." She adjusted the herbs in Aelis's diet, adding nettle for iron and rue for strength. She also began carrying a tiny carved bone spoon in her pouch, a tool for measuring powders that might be needed during the birthing. Aelis asked no questions, though sometimes her gaze lingered too long on Isabel's hands, as if wondering what pain they had seen. The household fell into a new kind of silence, one not of fear, but of waiting. Even the children, normally so loud and restless, played more softly now. They had been told stories of the coming babe, of how a new soul would soon live among them. One little girl, no older than 7, left a dried daisy crown on Aelis's pillow one afternoon. "For the baby's head," she said shyly before running off. There were, of course, darker conversations spoken only when Aelis slept. Late at night, by the fading embers of the hearth, the elder women gathered. They spoke of signs, the colour of Aelis's urine, the position of her swelling, the heat in her palms. They debated over whether the child would come early or late, whether it would be a boy or girl. But always beneath their words was the deeper worry: would both mother and child survive? For all the beauty of birth, the truth lingered like smoke. Infections, blood loss, breech positions, stillbirths, these were the silent shadows that followed every expectant mother. The women knew them well. They had lost sisters, friends, sometimes even daughters. And so they prepared not just herbs and linens, but their hearts, quietly bracing for either joy or mourning. Aelis herself carried both fear and peace in equal measure. She did not speak of death, but sometimes her fingers traced small symbols into the ashes on the hearthstone, protective runes she had seen carved into door frames or etched into wooden bowls. She wore a silver coin on a string around her neck, a gift from her mother, believed to guard against evil spirits. And every night, before sleep, she murmured the same prayer: "Let it pass like the tide. Let me rise with the dawn." The unborn child, unaware of all this preparation, continued to grow, pressing outward against her skin with restless urgency. Aelis could no longer tie her shoes nor bend fully to wash. Her steps became slower, her breath shorter. The child rode high some days, low on others. The midwife would press her hands along the swell, nodding or frowning slightly, but saying little. "The child moves well," was all she would say aloud. As the 8th moon waned, signs began to change. Aelis felt pressure in her lower back, a dull ache that came and went like waves against a dock. Her appetite waned. Sleep was harder now, interrupted by cramps, by dreams, by the sudden fluttering of her heart in the night. She began to weep more easily, often for no reason at all. The women called it the loosening of the spirit, a softening that came before labour. It was not weakness, but a necessary unravelling. The final weeks approached, and the house became a haven. Neighbours stopped calling, children were kept away, even the hens were moved to the far side of the yard. A stillness settled over everything, as though the world were holding its breath. And in the centre of it all sat Alis, quietly awaiting the moment when her body would open to the world and the ancient work of birth would begin. The air had grown heavier in recent days, thick with midsummer's warmth and the scent of wildflowers just past their bloom. Bees drifted lazily through open shutters, and even the birds, usually so restless in the hedgerows, seemed subdued. Inside the house, the hush was near complete. The hearth crackled only faintly, for little was needed in the way of heat. Instead, dried lavender bundles swung gently from the beams above, and bowls of rosewater were placed near Alis's bed to cool her face and hands. She lay back often, not out of laziness, but because her body demanded it. The weight of the child pressed low, and her hips ached with each shift. Her ankles were swollen, her breath shallow, and sleep came only in small, scattered fragments. Each night she was wrapped in soft linens and dabbed with oils of chamomile and clary sage, soothing herbs meant to calm the mind and ease the restless heart. And still, beneath it all, there was the waiting. Labour, it was said, rarely arrived without warning. The women of the household watched Alis with ever keener eyes. They knew the signs well: the sudden quietness, the flushed cheeks, the way a woman's voice changed when she was close. A low, inward tone, as if her soul had already begun to draw inward, preparing for the storm. Isabel, the midwife, came to stay now. She slept near the fire with a satchel of tools always within reach. Beeswax candles, clean thread, and a knife sharpened more from ritual than use. Each evening she would press her hands low against Alis's belly, feeling for the child's position. "The head is down," she said softly one morning, her breath carrying the scent of fennel and clove. "That is good." She did not say more. There was no need. The birthing bed was freshly made. Thick straw lay beneath layers of linen, and beside it a wooden basin waited, filled with warmed water steeped in rosemary. Old superstition held that rosemary warded off spirits, though its clean, pine-like scent also served to freshen the air and soothe weary senses. A clean cloth was folded on a nearby stool, alongside a vessel of honeyed wine meant to strengthen Alis when the time came. It was the same mixture used by her grandmother and her grandmother's mother before her. On the morning of the 9th moon's rise, a subtle change unfolded. Alis awoke before dawn, her body tense with a feeling she could not name. She sat upright slowly, her palms pressed to the curve of her belly, and she knew. There had been no dramatic pain, no rush of water, just a quiet, persistent pressure, a drawing inward like the tide pulling at the shore. She said nothing, only looked toward Isabel, who already begun to stir. "It's time," the midwife said simply. The other women moved silently into place. Water was heated in the large copper pot over the fire. Towels were warmed and stacked. A small pot of goose fat was laid open to soften the skin to ease the baby's passage. Alis was helped to the birthing stool, her legs trembling slightly beneath her, though she said not a word. Her breath was shallow but steady, her eyes wide and focused. Labour, they all knew, was its own kind of journey, inward and ancient. No one could walk it for her. The first pains were mild, like a slow tightening in her lower back, easing and returning in waves. Alis gripped the arms of the stool lightly, her knuckles pale. The women sang low chants under their breath, rhythmic and soothing. Their voices wove through the warm, herb-scented air, not to mask the pain, but to keep fear at bay. Isabel knelt beside her, her voice steady, her hands gentle. "Breathe when it builds," she murmured. "Let it come, and then let it go." She had said this to dozens of women before, but each time it was new. Each birth carried its own mystery, its own rhythm. The sun rose slowly, casting golden shafts of light through the shutters. Birds called in the trees, unaware of the sacred work unfolding behind stone walls. Alis groaned softly as the contractions grew sharper. Her hair clung to her face, damp with sweat. Her body had entered the deep part of labour now, where pain and time blurred into a single endless current. Still, she did not scream. She moaned, low and steady, a sound like wind moving through branches. The women wiped her brow with lavender water and whispered prayers between her cries. One clutched a small relic of Saint Margaret, pressing it lightly to Alis's shoulder. Another held a spoonful of honey to her lips, which she took with trembling resolve. By midday, the pains came swiftly, each one stronger than the last. Alis leaned forward, gripping the stool, her face flushed and wet with effort. Her breaths came in shallow bursts and tears streamed from the corners of her eyes. "It burns," she gasped once, and Isabel nodded, her hands ready. "That is the fire," she said softly. "The child comes through it." Then came the great push, the moment when time itself seemed to halt. Alis cried out, not in fear but in force, her body trembling from head to toe. The women's voices rose slightly, still gentle but urgent now. "Breathe, child. You are almost there. One more, just one more." And then, like the breaking of a wave, it happened. A cry pierced the stillness, not Alis's, but the child's. High, thin, and sharp as flint. Isabel moved with swift grace, lifting the newborn and wrapping it in a linen square warmed by the hearth. The cord was tied with red thread, then cut with a blessed knife. Alis collapsed backward, her chest heaving, her face pale and damp. She had gone to the edge of the world and returned. The babe, red, squirming, and full of voice, was laid upon her chest. Alis stared, wide-eyed and silent, tears slipping freely now. She reached with shaking hands, touching the child's downy head. The women stepped back, letting the moment settle, their own eyes shining. Outside, the village remained unaware. But within that quiet stone house, a miracle had occurred. Not one of saints or relics, but of flesh and will. Alis had done what generations of women before her had done. She had crossed the veil and brought back life. The room had grown still once more, yet the stillness was of a different kind, not of waiting, but of reverence. The only sound now was the soft breathing of Alis and her newborn, pressed together like two leaves on the same stem. Her fingers moved slowly across the child's back, feeling the warmth and weight of a life now separated from her own, yet still tethered by something deeper than cord or skin. The other women moved quietly around them, voices hushed, hands practiced. The afterbirth was delivered gently, placed into a linen-wrapped bowl to be buried later beneath the elder tree at the edge of the garden. It was custom, a way of returning what was borrowed from the earth. Isabel inspected the expelled tissue with careful eyes, murmuring under her breath, ensuring all had passed cleanly. Any part left behind could mean danger, but nothing seemed amiss. Alis lay limp, half awake, her body no longer heavy with burden but worn through by the work. Her legs ached, her hips throbbed, and a dull soreness spread through every limb. Yet her gaze never left the child curled against her chest, its mewling now softened into a dozy hum. She did not yet ask if it was a boy or girl. It did not matter, not yet. Isabel dabbed between her legs with cloths soaked in warm water and comfrey. There was blood, as there always was, thick and dark, more than the body could afford to lose. Yet Alis remained steady. Her pulse was weak but present. Her breath, though shallow, stayed even. The midwife packed her with soft wool soaked in wine and yarrow, muttering prayers as she worked. Bloodletting was never done after childbirth. A woman could not afford the loss. Instead, they sealed and soothed and watched. The child whimpered and wriggled. One of the women, a cousin of Alis, stepped forward with a small wooden spoon and dipped it into a cup of milked oats sweetened with honey. The tip was placed gently to the babe's lips, who suckled weakly, confused by the newness of sensation. It would not be long before Alis offered the breast, but for now she needed to rest, and the child, hungry and restless, would wait no more. Outside, the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Evening bells from the chapel echoed faintly through the hills, though no one inside stirred to count them. Time had fallen away. Hours had passed, perhaps a full day. No one could say with certainty. In childbirth, the clock becomes meaningless. When at last Alis stirred fully, her first question was simple, soft-spoken, almost unsure. "Is it whole?" she asked, her voice barely louder than breath. Isabel smiled, her face creased with relief. "Whole and strong," she replied. "All fingers, all toes. The eyes opened already, a good sign." Alis nodded faintly and closed her eyes again. It was not long before she was encouraged to feed the child herself. She winced as the infant latched, her breast tender, the sensation sharp. But then came the warmth, the rhythm, the knowing that this was what her body was meant to do. The child suckled greedily, its small hands fisting against her chest, and she cradled it closer, pressing a kiss to its crown. The naming would come later. It was not rushed. In many households, especially among the cautious, a child might not be named until the third day, or sometimes not until baptized. Life in those first days was fragile. Some did not stay. And to name a soul too soon was to anchor hope too deeply. Instead, the baby was referred to simply as the little one or the new leaf. Sometimes a nickname would emerge: Bright Eye, Whisper, Mouse. But Ailys called it nothing, just held it close and breathed, trying to recall the shape of herself now that she was two people. The other women began to take turns watching her. No new mother was left alone. Every moment of those first hours mattered: the colour of her lips, the clarity of her speech, the feel of her skin. Fever could set in suddenly. Bleeding might return. The worst danger had passed, but others lingered in the shadows. A broth was prepared, rich with marrow, onions, parsley, and a touch of garlic. Ailys drank it slowly, her hands trembling with each lift of the spoon. They followed it with bread softened in milk and a small cup of ale laced with herbs to promote milk flow. Food was medicine now. That night, Ailys slept, her child nestled in the crook of her arm, both wrapped in layers of wool. A single beeswax candle burned low on the nearby table, watched by Isabel, who did not sleep but sat with her spindle, spinning quietly through the hours. It was said that a child's soul could wander in its first night, drawn by the spirits of the air. A flame kept close was meant to anchor it, and the quiet hum of the spinning wheel lulled both mother and child into a safe, tethered slumber. Outside, the village was dark and still. A lone owl called from the woods, and beneath the soil, where the afterbirth had been buried, the earth closed gently around its gift. The next morning, as the mist lifted from the fields and the sky began to warm with light, the small household stirred to life again. Chickens clucked from their coop, and a neighbour arrived with fresh herbs and dried apples, offered without a word. News of the birth had begun to spread, though no bells had rung. It was a quiet joy, the kind that moved from hand to hand, from nod to nod. And Ailys, pale but glowing with the strange strength of survival, woke to the gentle nudging of her child's mouth and the realization that the hardest part was over, though the journey of motherhood had only just begun. The morning that followed the birth was cool and silvery, the kind of gentle light that seemed to pour softly over the hills, settling like dew on every stone and leaf. Inside the cottage, the fire had been stoked low, its warmth subtle but steady. The birthing linens had been washed and hung to dry in the loft, the birthing stool wiped clean and set aside, its crescent seat bearing faint impressions of hands and weight, quiet reminders of what had passed. Ailys remained in her bed, propped slightly against cushions made of sheep's wool and dried moss, her hair braided away from her face. She was pale still, the kind of paleness that did not alarm, but spoke of deep work done and blood still being called back to its place. Her lips were dry, her arms, though heavy with ache, curled protectively around the newborn who lay at her breast, nursing with contented rhythm. For 2 days, Ailys would not rise, not because she could not, but because custom forbade it. The lying-in period, that sacred threshold after birth, was strictly observed. A woman had passed through something holy and hazardous, and her body was now in the process of closing itself, gathering its strength and sealing the veil once more. The old belief was that if she walked too soon, her womb might fall. So she rested, and those around her moved with quiet vigilance. The household slipped into a rhythm centred entirely around Ailys and her child. Every few hours, someone brought warm broth, steeped with wild leeks, nettle, and bits of marrowbone. The herbs were chosen not just for flavour, but to strengthen the blood and warm the womb. She sipped slowly, each swallow renewing her just enough to go on. Between feedings she dozed, and when she stirred, Isabel was never far. The midwife checked the cloth beneath her, inspecting the flow of lochia, the weeks-long bleeding that followed birth. It was expected, even welcomed, but its colour told the tale. Bright red at first, then slowly browning, thinning, fading. If it returned to scarlet too soon, it meant trouble. If it stopped too quickly, it meant worse. But Ailys's body followed the path as it should, and Isabel, though watchful, did not worry. By the end of the second day, the child had begun to cry less and nurse with stronger gulps. It was then that Ailys's mother began to speak of naming. They waited until the third dawn, an old custom among villagers who believed that the soul was not truly anchored until the child had survived 3 nights of sleep. A flickering soul, they called it, tender as flame, easily stolen by the unseen. But once the third sunrise passed and the child suckled heartily that morning, the time came. The household gathered. No priest was called yet. Baptism would come in time. But among the women, a simple naming held weight. Ailís named the child Lynette for her grandmother, who had died the winter of the deep snow. A girl, then. The word passed in soft murmurs from one woman to the next, like a lit candle handed through darkness. Lynette. Small, pink-skinned, her eyes barely open, yet already claiming space in the world. Her cry was high and reedy, her fingers curled tightly around the cord of Ailís's shift. And still, even with the name given, the watching did not cease. The lying-in continued. Ailís remained mostly in bed, her movements slow and measured. Her belly had not yet returned to its old shape, though it had softened. Her breasts, once modest, were now full and swollen, marked faintly with the purpling lines of milk come in haste. The child fed often, sometimes with such strength that Ailís winced and leaned back to breathe. Her nipples, tender and cracked, were soothed with ointments made from goose fat, honey and plantain leaves, crushed fresh and laid on linen. Outside, summer had arrived in full. The fields shimmered with tall grass, and bees thickened in number near the flowering hedge. But Ailís only glimpsed it through the small open window. Her world was now the cradle, the bed, and the slow pattern of care. Visitors came and went quietly. Women only, for the most part. They brought gifts, woven swaddles, clay charms, small cheeses wrapped in leaves. Each came with their own stories, their own warnings and advice. Swaddle tight or the limbs will bend wrong. Never let the child sleep with its mouth open, spirits creep in. Wash her in chamomile on the 7th day, for luck. Ailís listened, smiled faintly and followed what she could. But mostly she trusted her instincts and the closeness of her own body to her child's. Lynette slept against her chest, stirred only for milk, and cried not from fear but hunger. When she did wail, Ailís would hum a tune her mother had once sung to her, a lullaby carried from some older place, with words only half remembered but melody intact. On the 5th day, Isabel bathed the baby for the first time. A small copper basin was set near the hearth, and water warmed until it steamed gently in the dim morning light. Lynette was unwrapped and laid bare, her body still unfamiliar with cold. She shrieked at first, her cries sharp and indignant. But as the warm water flowed over her scalp and belly, she quieted. The bath was ritual, not just for cleanliness, but to bless the body and cleanse what lingered from birth. Isabel rubbed a sprig of rosemary along the baby's arms and legs, then cupped water over her crown, whispering the same words she had spoken to dozens before. You are washed of shadow. You are bound to breath and bone. You are kept. Afterward, Lynette was swaddled tightly and tucked into Ailís's arms once more. She slept deeply then, her tiny mouth parted just slightly, her chest rising with the gentlest of sighs. Ailís, watching her, felt something unfamiliar stirring. Not relief, not joy exactly, but a kind of awe. A quiet, full knowing that she had crossed a threshold, not just in body but in life. She was no longer simply daughter or maiden. She had entered the old circle of women who had bled, borne, fed and guarded. And now, as the sun filtered through the shutters and the soft scent of milk and lavender filled the room, she understood what the older women had meant when they spoke of birth, not as a single act, but as a becoming. The days unfolded like petals, soft, slow, each one a mirror of the last, yet subtly changed. Ailís remained in her chamber through much of it, her life now measured in the time between feedings, in the rise and fall of Lynette's small chest, in the quiet throb of her own healing body. Outside, the village moved on. Cows were milked, grain harvested, and travellers passed along the dusty road with little thought for the small miracle tucked behind those stone walls. Within, time was wrapped in layers of linen and lullabies. On the 7th day, the child was brought into the sunlight for the first time. It was tradition, but also necessity, to let the morning light touch her skin, to open her eyes to the world. The sky was pale and clear, the warmth of summer just gentle enough. Ailís was carried by her mother to the edge of the herb garden, a blanket laid over her knees, the baby cradled in her arms. The midwife, Isabel, stood near, watching with quiet reverence. Lynette blinked against the light, her expression unsure. Her small limbs, freed from swaddling for just a moment, waved softly in the breeze. Ailís held her close, murmuring under her breath. The exact words were not shared, but the meaning was clear. a greeting to the sun, a blessing for breath, a wish for days long and life kind. They remained only a short while. The air was too rich, too new. Back inside, a fresh linen cradle had been prepared beside Ailes's bed. Carved from a hollowed-out log and lined with wool, it rocked gently with the slightest touch. Inside, small charms had been sewn into the corners, sprigs of rue for protection, a tiny scrap of red thread to guard against envy, and a feather from a barn owl, said to ensure wise dreams. Ailes had not yet walked unassisted. Her legs trembled too easily, and her balance was not yet true. But each day she shifted a little more, sat a little longer, and reached farther. Her strength was returning in small, quiet ways. The flow of blood continued, darker now, slower, and was checked each morning. Isabel remarked with approval that her womb was closing well. No fever, no foul scent, no unnatural swell. All was as it should be. Her appetite too had returned. She now took fuller meals. Stewed lentils with garlic, soft bread soaked in goat's milk, eggs boiled gently with nettle. She drank infusions made of raspberry leaf and dandelion, her belly warmed by broth seasoned with thyme and marjoram. Food was not just nourishment now, but a medicine against weakness. Visitors increased with each passing day. Women from the village came in pairs, always bearing gifts, a skein of dyed wool, a small jar of honey, a carved rattle, a thimble's worth of salt wrapped in cloth. With each came stories of their own births, of losses endured, of superstitions passed down like heirlooms. They spoke of the signs of health, a round belly, a strong cry, firm limbs, and they whispered too of what to fear, a child who would not suckle, who did not flinch at noise, who slept too deeply and too long. Lynette so far met each test with sleepy resilience. She cried heartily when wet or hungry. She clutched at Ailes's fingers. Her eyes, though still cloudy, tracked light when it moved. "She is strong," said Isabel, tracing the length of Lynette's spine with a firm finger. "She has held fast to this world." Ailes sometimes wept without knowing why. It would come suddenly, after a feeding, or in the quiet between footsteps. Her heart would swell with love, then ache with something unnamed. The women did not scold her. They said only, "It's the opening of the soul," and brought her warm water and rest. It was not sadness, not entirely, more like a swelling of the heart, too full to hold itself. Her body bore new marks. Her belly was soft and creased with faint purple lines. Her breasts were round, heavy and tender. Her hips ached when she shifted, and yet she found herself unbothered by it all. Her body, once a thing she barely considered, had become a vessel, then a shelter, and now a wellspring. She bore it with quiet pride. One afternoon, her mother brought her a new garment, a smock of softer wool, dyed the colour of river clay. Its seams widened to allow for her changed form. "It will breathe better," she said gently. Ailes slipped it over her head and felt the cloth settle over her shoulders. It was the first time she had dressed in something other than her birthing shift since Lynette's arrival. A change was coming. The lying-in period would soon draw to its close. Traditionally, it lasted 40 days, the span of time in which a woman was considered unclean by some, holy by others. It was a paradox of sorts. To bleed was to be powerful, yet also vulnerable. During this time, Ailes was not to enter the chapel, nor share in certain rituals. She was set apart, not shunned, but sheltered. The priest had already sent word. He would come in a fortnight's time to perform the churching, the rite of purification, a ritual of re-entry into the sacred spaces of the village. It was both a blessing and a return. Until then, Ailes would remain in her home, her world bordered by stone walls, soft cloth, and the heartbeat of her child. At night, the house fell into deeper silence. The sounds of summer, crickets in the thatch, the rustle of hedgehogs in the garden, replaced the rustle of straw and wood. Ailes slept lightly, waking at every murmur from the cradle. Lynette fed often through the dark hours, her small lips seeking comfort more than nourishment. Each time, Ailes rose without complaint, pressing the child close, her hair falling like a veil over both their faces. And in those moments, when the fire burned low and the shadows crept gently over the walls, Ailes felt herself become something new entirely. Not just a woman, not even just a mother, but part of something vast and ancient, a thread in the long weaving of life that stretched through time, quiet and strong, like breath in the night. The summer deepened, fields turned golden, and the village lanes thickened with dust that clung to hems and ankles alike. The scent of ripening grain and wild chamomile hung in the air. Inside the stone cottage, though, the world remained shaded and slow, a sanctuary sealed in rhythm and routine. Alice, now in her third week of lying in, began to reclaim parts of her body and space, but gently, cautiously, as though stepping into a new skin. Lynette had grown fuller, her cheeks plumped with milk, and her limbs, once so delicate and bird-like, now held the hint of strength. Her cries were sharper, her movements more willful. She no longer slept through every sound. Now the creak of a floorboard or the flutter of wings outside the shuttered window might rouse her. Yet she also began to fix her gaze, however briefly, on the faces that hovered near, especially her mother's. Alice felt the pull of her child, even in sleep, as though an invisible string connected their breaths. Her dreams were rarely her own anymore. Sometimes she dreamed of Lynette tumbling from her arms into water, her cries lost in the rush. Other times she dreamed of walking barefoot through the forest, the child on her hip, leaves whispering secrets as they passed. These dreams lingered, weightless yet profound, and she often awoke unsure if she had travelled somewhere real. Her body continued its slow mending. The bleeding, now nearly gone, had turned pale and thin. The soreness between her legs ebbed little by little, and the sharp edge of birth pain softened into a dull memory. Her appetite returned in full, her body craving iron-rich stews, creamy barley porridges, and boiled eggs dusted with ground mustard seed. The women obliged, smiling at her renewed hunger. "The womb is closing well," Isabel said one evening, after checking her pulse and pressing lightly upon her abdomen. "You are nearly yourself again." But Alice knew she would never be exactly as she had been. When she first stood without help, it was near dusk. Her legs quivered, but her spine held. Her arms, cradling Lynette, seemed to remember the weight naturally. She took slow steps to the hearth, where the fire glowed beneath a hanging pot of lentils. Her mother, who had turned just in time to see her, said nothing, only offered a steadying hand. It was a small act, one quiet walk, but in that moment it felt like the turning of a season. With her returning strength, Alice resumed gentle tasks. She sorted herbs from their drying lines, sage, thyme and marigold, stripping leaves and tucking them into linen pouches. She rocked Lynette in her cradle while sewing a new swaddling cloth from flax and red thread. The rhythm of the house shifted again, this time to include her as more than just patient or vessel. She was moving back into her place among them. One morning she was led to the garden, her feet brushing soft thyme underfoot. Lynette slept against her chest in a sling of woven wool. The sun was warm but mild, and the breeze carried the scent of lavender and stone. Alice sat on a bench near the gooseberry bush, where she could watch bees hum between blooms and feel the sun touch her skin for the first time in weeks. The garden had changed in her absence. What had been buds were now full blossoms. What had been shoots were now tall stalks bearing seed. The smallness of the moment, the quiet fullness of it, brought a sudden ache to her throat. She did not cry, but she pressed her lips to Lynette's head and closed her eyes, letting the peace of the place fill her bones. That afternoon, Isabel brought a small jar of thick golden ointment. It had been made from goose fat, elderflower and yarrow, stirred slowly over the fire for hours. She applied it to Alice's belly, where the skin had stretched and softened, where faint lines now curved like rivers over the surface. "You have marked the map of motherhood," she said quietly. "These are not scars, but stories." The midwife also began preparing Alice for the ritual of churching, the formal reintroduction into the sacred life of the village. While not every woman followed the tradition with devotion, it remained a powerful symbol, not of guilt, as some believed, but of blessing, of a woman made whole again, of her safe return from the veil between life and death. In preparation, a bath was drawn. Alice was helped into the large wooden tub filled with warm water steeped in mint, rose petals and linden blossom. The bath was more than cleansing, it was ceremonial. The women combed her hair, gently unwound the braids and washed away the remnants of birth and confinement. They spoke no words during the process, only soft hums, a kind of music that wove between their hands and breath. When she stepped from the bath, she was wrapped in a robe of soft, undyed linen. Her skin smelled of earth and flowers, her hair dark and wet against her back. For the first time since Lynette's birth, she saw her reflection in the polished bronze mirror beside the hearth. She did not startle at the image. She studied it. Her cheeks were hollowed slightly, her eyes deeper set, but her gaze was steady. She was not lesser, only different. In the cradle, Lynette stirred. Ailís crossed the room with sure steps, gathered the child to her breast, and fed her without pain. The milk came easily now, a river that flowed with no resistance. The baby suckled, her fingers curling gently into the folds of her mother's robe. Outside, a dove cooed from the eaves, and the shadows of evening began to lengthen once more. There was still much to face: sleepless nights, fevered cries, the weight of a child's every breath held in her own chest. But at the end of this day, Ailís felt something like balance return, a sense that the earth had tilted just enough for her to begin again, not as she was, but as she was meant to become. By the time the 40th day approached, the light had taken on the faint golden hue that signals summer's slow retreat. The days remained warm, but the mornings were edged with a delicate coolness that curled into the corners of the cottage before the hearth was kindled. Outside, the wheat fields rippled like sheets of spun gold, and the first whisperings of harvest drifted through the village. Within the quiet rhythms of Ailís's home, a new anticipation stirred. The day of churching had arrived. The ritual was simple, and its form varied from one village to the next, but the meaning held fast across generations, a blessing, a crossing back. In the old language of the church, it was a purification, a rite of return. But among the women, the ones who bled and bore and cradled, it was more tenderly known as the coming forth. Ailís had risen early, long before the sun had cleared the treetops. The house was still in half darkness, the only light from the embers of the fire and a single beeswax candle on the table. Lynette was swaddled and resting in her cradle, lulled by the gentle pressure of full feed and the constant beat of her mother's presence. Her breaths were even and small, her mouth forming a perfect circle in sleep. Isabel arrived with a bundle beneath her arm, a freshly laundered gown of undyed wool and a linen veil edged with lace, yellowed slightly with age. "It belonged to your grandmother," she said. She wore it after her last child. Ailís dressed slowly. Her body still moved with deliberation, though it no longer trembled. Her belly had softened further, her breasts felt less swollen, and her legs now carried her weight without complaint. She ran a comb through her hair, separating the strands that had clung together in the long days of lying in. Her mother helped tie the gown at the waist, leaving it loose and unbound across her middle. The veil was laid across her head, a symbol of modesty but also of reverence for the journey she had made. No perfume was used, just a few drops of rosemary oil pressed into her collarbone, a scent that lingered clean and strong, known to chase away illness and grief. The path to the chapel was short but winding, shaded by trees that had watched generations of villagers pass beneath their branches. Ailís walked slowly, flanked by her mother and Isabel. Lynette remained at home with her aunt, sleeping soundly in the warmth of her cradle. It was tradition that the mother come alone, not as two, but as one returning from the other side. The chapel itself was small, a single nave, stone walls thick with moss, and a roof patched over time with wood and thatch. Its door stood open. The priest, a man of gentle age and gentler voice, waited within, dressed in plain vestments of faded green and white. He greeted Ailís with a nod, offering neither congratulations nor questions, only a blessing, murmured in Latin, and a pitcher of water for the rite. Ailís knelt at the threshold, her hands resting on the stone floor worn smooth by centuries of prayer. The priest dipped his fingers in the water and let droplets fall across her brow, then spoke the words of return, not just to the church, but to life itself. "You have walked through fire and shadow," he said softly, in the old tongue, "and you are come again into the light." There was no great ceremony, no audience, no song, only silence and the slow lifting of Ailís's head, her veil catching the light from a stained glass window above the altar, the one that depicted St. Margaret stepping forth from the belly of the dragon. The same saint who had watched over her labour, the same image that now reflected across her skin in soft hues of red and blue. Afterward, she did not linger. Outside, the village had begun to stir. A cart rumbled past, drawn by a thick-legged mule and driven by a boy no older than 10. He waved, and Ailís nodded in return. Her steps felt firmer now, as if the ritual had pressed her feet more deeply into the earth. When she reached the cottage again, the door was open. The scent of warm milk and baking bread met her as she stepped inside. Lynette had just awakened and was being rocked gently by her aunt. At the sight of Ailís, the child turned her head, mouth seeking, fingers curling. Ailís took her into her arms and held her close. That evening, a simple supper was laid out in quiet celebration. Barley stew with onion, flatbread still warm from the iron pan, and sweetened milk spiced with cinnamon. A small candle was lit and a blessing spoken, not by the priest but by her mother, in the old words passed through the women of the family. Words not written, only remembered. Later, when the stars began to prick the sky and the child slept soundly in the crook of Ailís's arm, she stepped once more outside. The garden was silent. The lavender had begun to fade. The thyme was woody and strong. The bees were gone to sleep. Ailís stood among them, bare feet pressing into the soil, and felt the weight of the 40 days fall away like a shawl from her shoulders. She was not healed completely, not yet. Her sleep was still thin. Her thoughts still wandered in the dark. Her breasts still ached, but she no longer felt apart from the world. She was back within it, bearing its shape in her limbs and its rhythm in her breath. And now, as the night air brushed her cheeks and the wind rustled the leaves overhead, Ailís whispered softly to the moon. A prayer of thanks, not for ease but for endurance. She had crossed the threshold, and the path ahead was hers. With the ritual of return behind her, Ailís found herself once more amid the gentle pulse of daily life. Yet nothing was quite the same. The world she had stepped back into bore a different colour, a deeper hush. Each small act, lifting a basket of herbs, pressing dough into flatbread, folding linens with sun-warmed hands, felt newly sacred. She moved slower, not from wariness, but from a newfound attentiveness, as though each gesture carried within it the echo of labour, the breath of birth. Lynette, now 6 weeks old, had begun to unfurl. No longer a blinking, swaddled mystery, she now tracked the light with her gaze and cooed at familiar voices. Her hands fluttered toward Ailís's face during feedings, brushing clumsily across cheeks and chin. At night, she no longer cried from hunger alone. Sometimes she simply wanted presence, the reassuring curve of her mother's body against her own. Ailís had learned to respond with soft humming, holding her close while tracing gentle circles across the child's back until sleep returned. The house had eased back into a quiet routine. With the lying-in completed and Ailís's strength mostly restored, her place among the women resumed, though now with a certain hush of deference. She had crossed into motherhood, and even the younger girls who once teased her now met her with a steadier gaze. She was no longer Ailís, the midwife's niece, nor the seamstress's daughter. She was simply Lynette's mother. Still, questions came. At the well, where women gathered with clay jugs balanced against hips, the whispers stirred. No father had yet been named. No man had been seen coming or going from Ailís's door. And though her family remained respected and no shame was cast outright, the silence around the matter had only deepened the curiosity. One woman, older and braver than most, asked quietly one morning as Ailís lifted water from the cool depths. "Is it true, then, that she was born from prayer alone?" Ailís did not answer. She only smiled, not in secrecy, but in peace. Some stories she knew were not meant for public telling, and in truth, the child's origin mattered less than her presence now, warm, alive, cradled close to her chest as the water sloshed in the bucket beside her. Her nights remained half-waking. Lynette fed often, as most babies did, and Ailís learned to sleep lightly, ears attuned to every stir. By candlelight she often sat upright, her shawl draped across her shoulders, rocking gently while the rest of the household dozed. These hours were hers alone, silent but for the faint crackle of coals and the soft smacks of a nursing babe. Sometimes her thoughts wandered. She would remember her own mother's arms, the songs hummed into her ear, the way her forehead had been cooled with mint leaves during fevered nights. And she wondered, as all new mothers do, whether she would know enough, be strong enough, be steady enough to offer the same comfort to her child in the years ahead. There were already small challenges. Lynette had begun to fuss during daylight sleep. She stirred easily, wailing without clear cause. Some women called it colic, others said it was wind caught in the belly. while Isabel simply pressed her ear to the child's chest, then her lips to her brow, and declared, "She feels the change in season." Alice tried everything. Warm oil rubbed across the belly, gentle bouncing in arms, spoonfuls of fennel tea offered drop by drop. Some methods helped, others didn't. But through each moment of distress, Alice remained calm. Not because she did not worry, but because she understood now that her calm was the child's shelter. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. When Alice sang, Lynette's eyes lit with recognition. When she cried, as all babies did, a simple touch to her cheek often brought her back from tears. Their language, though without words, grew more fluent by the hour. A glance, a breath, a shift in posture, all held meaning. In the village, harvest season approached. Men spoke of grain yields and women stitched sacks from coarse hemp cloth. Alice helped mend aprons and prepare bundles of dried lavender for storage. Lynette often lay swaddled nearby on a thick woolen blanket, shaded beneath a canopy of elder branches. Her fingers curled like tiny question marks as she slept. The cottage itself took on the feeling of continuity, of a place passed down not through walls or stone, but through lived memory. The scent of milk and rosemary, the soft thud of a cradle against the floor. The sound of lullabies drifting into the night air, woven with the distant hoot of owls and the rustle of field mice. In the evenings, when the tasks of the day were finished and the fire burned low, Alice sometimes sat with the other women, her child asleep in her arms. They spoke of ordinary things, harvest plans, winter stores, the stubbornness of goats, but beneath it all was the quiet respect for what Alice had endured and become. They did not say it aloud. They did not need to. She had joined them in full, and though no certificate marked it, no feast celebrated it, the truth settled in every fold of cloth, every bowl of steaming broth, every knowing glance passed across the hearth. Alice was now of the circle, not just by blood but by passage, and in the heart of the home, Lynette grew, not with noise or haste, but with the gentle certainty of a candle quietly burning through the longest nights. The days shortened, though subtly at first, like a sigh before sleep. The air carried a faint crispness now, especially in the mornings when mist curled low over the fields, silvering the tops of the rye and barley. Children's laughter echoed less often through the lanes, and the clamour of harvest carts grew louder, the wooden wheels groaning under the weight of grain, straw, and the season's last hay. Inside the cottage, the tempo of life had adjusted to autumn's hush. Alice, now fully restored in strength, moved through her days with quiet purpose. Lynette had reached her second month, her limbs no longer curled close as they had been in the womb, but stretching gently in curious flutters. Her eyes, once clouded and wandering, now fixed with startling intensity. She followed her mother's movements, recognised her voice, and often smiled in the moments before sleep. That smile, brief and fluttering like a moth's wing, became the heart of Alice's days. With the harvest in motion, the cottage grew busier. Herbs hung thicker from the beams above, drying in bunches tied with string and ribbon. Every surface not in use bore baskets of produce, late apples, knotty carrots, broad beans shelled and sorted. Women came and went with aprons stained from elderberry juice and hands dusted in flour. Alice took part when she could, Lynette tucked into a sling across her chest, the child's head nestled against the rise and fall of her breath. She stirred stews with one hand, plated garlic for winter storage, and helped sort chickpeas and lentils into clay jars. Her labour was light, but her presence constant. And that presence, the simple showing up to life's tasks with child in arm, gave her a deepened sense of belonging. One afternoon, while separating seeds from dried thistle, Alice overheard a conversation between two elder women. They spoke not of crops or weather, but of memory. Births long past, children grown and gone, the ache of time's passing. One recalled the loss of a child during a bitter winter, her voice steady but weighted. The other described the joy of a boy born during spring's thaw, who now lived far to the south. Neither woman spoke of regret, only of the great and constant tide that carries mothers across their years, through love, grief, fear and quiet hope. Alice listened without interrupting. Their words did not frighten her. If anything, they grounded her. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that to be a mother was not simply to nourish and protect, but to carry, to hold joy and sorrow both, like twin bundles across the shoulders. That night, when Lynette woke with a cry sharper than usual, Ailís rose without hesitation. She lit no candle, finding her way by memory in the pale light of the half-moon seeping through the shutters. The child's body felt hot and restless. Her cry did not calm with feeding. Ailís pressed her lips to Lynette's forehead and found warmth too high for comfort. She summoned her mother without panic. A pot of water was set to heat. Cloths were dampened with elderflower and thyme, then laid across the child's belly and neck. Isabel was sent for, arriving with her pouch of dried herbs and a gaze that missed nothing. She examined Lynette carefully, her touch gentle but firm, and murmured that it was likely a fever of the season, common in infants as the winds began to change. Still, they watched her through the night. Ailís did not sleep. She held Lynette wrapped close, wiping her brow every hour, whispering soft nothings and lullabies too old to name. She felt fear, yes, a low thrum in the chest, but not helplessness. She had crossed that line weeks ago. She was no longer waiting for someone to save her child. She was the one doing the saving. By morning, Lynette's fever had broken. She lay cooler, breath slow, cheeks damp with sweat but flushed with health. Her eyes opened briefly and searched the room before closing again, her mouth making small suckling motions in her sleep. Ailís let out the breath she hadn't known she was holding. The child had endured. The women praised her calm. They said, "You knew what to do." But Ailís only nodded. It was not knowledge in the way of scrolls or lessons. It was a knowing that came from the body, from stillness, from watching and entrusting something older than speech. After that night, Ailís felt even more deeply rooted. She began taking Lynette with her into the village for short errands, to the baker's for a round of barley bread, to the weaver's to mend a torn hem. Each time, she swaddled the child in layers of wool and linen, binding her snug against the early chill. And each time, she moved a little more freely, stepping further from the quiet confines of the hearth, back into the world she had once known. Villagers greeted her warmly. Even those who had once gossiped about Lynette's paternity now smiled without guile, peering into the blanket to glimpse the child's dark eyes and ruddy cheeks. Ailís did not offer explanations. She offered only kindness, and in time that was enough. One market morning, an old woman stopped her in the square and handed her a small carved charm. A crescent moon etched into bone hung on a thin leather cord. "For the little one," she said, pressing it gently into Ailís's palm, "for dreaming well." Ailís thanked her, tucking the charm into the folds of Lynette's blanket. That night, when the child stirred and whimpered, she wore it tucked near her heart and fell asleep without another sound. The season continued to turn, the wind sharpened, leaves browned and curled at their edges. But within the walls of that simple stone cottage, life pulsed onward with quiet strength. The kind of strength found in breath, in milk, in the steady rocking of a cradle as the first cold rains tapped gently on the roof. The first frost came in silence, as it always did, not with thunder or wind, but with a thin veil of white across the earth, laid gently like a breath held before the hush of winter. It coated the thatch of roofs, the low stone walls, and the bare edges of hedgerows. When Ailís stepped outside just before dawn, Lynette bundled against her chest. She saw her breath rise in small silver clouds, and knew that the season had shifted for good. Inside, the fire was kept burning from morning to night. Wood was stacked high near the hearth, and rushes thickened with lavender and rosemary were laid across the floor to warm the stone beneath their feet. Lynette's cradle was moved closer to the fire, and extra swaddling was layered into her bedding. Old wool, lined linen, a rabbit fur square gifted by a neighbour whose own children were now grown. The household, like the village beyond, turned inward. With winter's approach came a kind of stillness, but not idleness. The women spun thread from flax and wool, their hands moving with steady rhythm. Ailís joined them now, her spindle lighter than theirs, her fingers still gaining confidence. Lynette lay beside her in a woven basket lined with sheep's fleece, blinking slowly, her hands now free of swaddling during the day. She watched the spinning wheel turn, its hum a lullaby older than memory. Ailís hummed too. Not always a song, sometimes just a sound to match the flicker of the fire or the sway of the cradle. Her voice had grown softer, lower since Lynette's birth, not from tiredness, but from the change that came with motherhood, the quiet need to comfort, to anchor, to soothe. Milk came easily now. Her body had settled into its new rhythm, and Lynette suckled with confidence. Gone were the aches of cracked skin and overfull days. Now the feeding was fluid, like breath. Ailís could nurse and speak, nurse and sew, nurse and drift into a light, half-aware rest while her child's lips worked gently against her skin. Still, with the cold came new vigilance. Fevers, coughs, chills. These visited even the strong. Each day, Isabel made her rounds, checking the village women and their children. She came to Ailís's home with a basket of dried horehound, hyssop and licorice root. Steep it in milk, she instructed, if the child wheezes. She also left a small cloth bag to hang above Lynette's cradle, filled with fennel, thyme and a pinch of salt. For warding. There was no sense of panic, only preparedness. Ailís felt the deepening of her role, not only as mother, but as keeper, of warmth, of nourishment, of safety. She watched the skies more closely now, noted the direction of the wind, the thickness of morning frost, the number of crows perched in the bare trees beyond the yard. All things, even small ones, were signs. Lynette began to coo in response to her mother's words, the sound soft and bubbling like spring water. When she smiled, it stretched across her entire face, eyes crinkling, gums bare and pink. These small exchanges, these first attempts at language, brought laughter back into Ailís's voice, light, warm and unguarded. In the afternoons, when the sun was at its brief peak, Ailís wrapped Lynette in layers and stepped outside. The wind bit at her cheeks, but the walk was short, just to the edge of the garden or down the slope to where the creek ran slow and clear. She carried Lynette close, whispering as they walked, pointing out the sleeping trees, the birds that remained, the last of the berries clinging like drops of blood to bare branches. These outings were brief, but important. The child, she believed, should know the sky, even in winter. One day, while out near the stone wall where the ground rose into the hills, she met another mother, Alna, a weaver's wife, with her own babe just a few weeks older than Lynette. They had spoken only briefly before, but now they sat together on a smooth rock warmed by the sun and let their children stretch. The babies made sounds toward one another, limbs flailing without purpose, but full of recognition. The two women talked of sleep, of herbs, of the strange and sudden fears that came without warning. Alna confessed that she sometimes woke in the night just to check if her child was breathing. Ailís nodded. "I do the same," she said. There was comfort in the naming of these thoughts. They were not weakness, only love worn thin with worry. When they parted, Alna offered a square of wool dyed with walnut and onion skin. "For your babe," she said. "Winter's long, it will help keep her dry." Ailís took it with gratitude. These small exchanges, cloth for cloth, herb for herb, story for story, were the lifeblood of motherhood in the village. Nothing was wasted, nothing forgotten. As the days grew colder still, the nights deepened, longer and more still than before. The hearth became a world unto itself. Shadows danced on the walls, and Lynette's eyes followed them, wide with wonder. Ailís told her stories then, not from books but from memory, tales her mother had told her. Stories of animals who wore cloaks and spoke in riddles, of stars that turned into silver geese, of mothers who sang the moon down into their cradles. Lynette listened, even if she did not yet understand. In this way the weeks passed, slow as snow falling, steady as milk flowing, warm as wool against cold skin. And in that house of stone and firelight, Ailís came to know a truth she had never grasped before Lynette's arrival, that love at its quietest is a kind of tending, not of grand gestures, but of daily acts, folding, feeding, watching, holding, singing a child through the darkness, one breath at a time. The nights settled deeper, darker now, and longer still. Winter's breath slipped through cracks in the stone walls, and even the fire, though tended with care, sometimes sputtered against the cold that crept in with the dusk. Frost traced delicate patterns across the inside of the window panes, feathers of ice that bloomed silently overnight. The village sank into the heart of the season. Inside Ailís's home, life moved by the rhythm of the hearth. The fire, tended before dawn and after dusk, was the centre of warmth and light, the place where bread was baked, milk warmed, and stories spoken in low, steady tones. It was also where Lynette now spent her days, bundled in layers of linen, wool, and a soft pelt lining her cradle. She had passed 3 moons of life, and was beginning to reveal herself more with each passing day. Her neck grew stronger, her gaze sharper. She began to lift her head briefly when held upright, her eyes fixed on flickering candlelight or the fluttering of a cloth in the draught. Her hands, once curled tight against her chest, now reached out, hesitant, tremulous, but reaching all the same. Ailys watched every change with the quiet wonder of one who has begun to understand the sacredness of small things. She no longer feared the sleepless nights or the sudden cries. Each sound, each motion, was a language unfolding between them. She had grown fluent in her daughter's needs, even before the child could speak. The other women noticed. Isabel said, "She's taking root in you," not meaning burden, but bond, a kind of deep joining that no thread could untangle. And Ailys felt it. Not as a weight, but as a tether, steady and warm. The tasks of the house resumed more fully. Bread was kneaded again beneath her hands, now firm with returning strength. She churned butter in the mornings, ground barley in the afternoons, and boiled dried beans and roots into thick stews that clung to the ribs. The kitchen smelled of rosemary, lard, smoke and broth. These scents, once background to her life, now marked her days with comfort and memory. And always near her, Lynette watched, eyes like dark winter pools, reflecting more than they revealed. There were new trials, of course. Lynette began to fuss in the evenings, a slow build of restlessness that no feeding could resolve. The women called it the twilight crying, a common unrest that settled on some babes just as the sun dipped behind the hills. Ailys tried everything, walking, singing, warm cloths, cradling by the hearth. Nothing soothed completely, though her presence alone softened the worst of it. One night, after hours of pacing and whispering, she simply wrapped Lynette in her thickest shawl and stepped outside. The sky was clear, dark, infinite. Stars glittered in cold silence, and her breath rose like smoke around her face. She stood in the yard, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots, and whispered lullabies to the stars instead of the cradle. Lynette quieted, perhaps from the chill, perhaps from the awe of that wide, open sky. When she returned inside, she found the child more at ease, her cries fading into sleep. From then on, whenever the evening restlessness came, Ailys would bundle them both and step into the night, not far, just to the edge of the yard, where the cold air wrapped around them like a veil, and the stars listened without judgment. There was something else happening too, though Ailys had no words for it. Her thoughts had grown wider, more searching. In the quiet moments between feedings and chores, she found herself remembering not just her own childhood, but stories she'd once heard spoken by elders, tales of women long gone, mothers and grandmothers who had raised children through war, famine, harsh winters, and long separations. She wondered if they too had held their children to their chests and felt the fragile fire beneath the ribs. Sometimes she whispered to those unseen women in her mind, not prayers exactly, but something close. Words like, "Was it like this for you?" And "What did you do when sleep would not come?" She felt them around her, not in ghostly presence, but in memory woven through daily ritual, the way her fingers moved across cloth, the way she held the spoon when feeding Lynette, the exact pitch of the song she hummed while swaying the cradle. She was beginning to understand that motherhood, in this time and place, was not a solitary thing. It was layered, ancient, communal, passed through gesture and glance, not written words. The warmth she gave to Lynette was the same warmth once given to her and to her mother before her. A current not of water but of care. One evening, her aunt brought a set of small shoes made from felted wool. Too soon for walking, she smiled, but good to warm her feet. They were soft and clumsy, stitched by hand, dyed with walnut hulls into a dusky brown. Ailys held them in her palm, astonished by their smallness. She tucked them under Lynette's blanket, warming them against her belly. And though Lynette would not wear them properly for many months yet, their presence reminded Ailys that change would come again, slowly, gently, but always. Already the child had grown. Already her first clothes were packed away in a chest by the hearth, folded with care, though stained by milk and time. Already her sounds were changing, her eyes focused longer, her legs kicked with more force. Winter would not last forever. For now, it held them in a quiet grip, not cruel but firm. Snow fell some nights, soft and slow, the world outside hushed by its weight, inside the cradle rocked, the fire glowed, and Ailys, mother now in marrow as well as mind, tended both flame and child with the same quiet devotion, steady, watchful and full of grace. The wind had shifted. It was not yet spring, not truly. The earth still held its breath beneath a crust of frost, and the trees stood bare, their limbs stretched like hands in prayer. But something subtle stirred in the air, a warmth not yet visible, a softness in the light that lengthened each afternoon. The crows returned to the edge of the village, cawing from stone walls and chimney tops, and a faint scent of thaw rose from the ground with the morning mist. Ailith felt it first not in the wind, but in her bones. She woke one morning with a sense of movement, of turning, the same sensation she had once felt in her womb when Lynette had begun to turn head down, preparing to meet the world. The body, she knew, often knew before the mind. Lynette was nearing her 4th month. Her cries had changed again, less frequent, more expressive. Her hands reached now with purpose, her fingers finding her mother's hair, tugging clumsily. She babbled often, especially in the mornings when the sun filtered through the shutters and painted golden bars across the floor. Ailith would set her in a basket near the hearth and work, while Lynette watched the flicker of flame and the shadows it cast. That basket had become a second cradle of sorts, padded with old wool and tucked with scraps of lavender-scented cloth. Lynette lay there when Ailith kneaded bread or combed flax or stitched the frayed hem of her winter smock. Sometimes the child would fall asleep, lulled by the rhythm of the work, the sound of scissors, the creak of the bench, the gentle humming of women bent to their tasks. Other times she would wail, indignant and full of voice, until lifted and cradled once more. The women teased Ailith gently. "She's taken your arms for her throne," one said, laughing as Lynette quieted the instant she was hoisted onto her mother's hip. But it was not mockery, it was recognition. They had all known it, that phase of need when a child would not be soothed except by the shape and scent of her mother. Ailith didn't mind. Her body had become strong again, though changed, her hips wider, her arms more toned from carrying, her waist not yet returned to its former curve, but she no longer looked for it. Her body, now, was not for the gaze of others. It was a shelter, a vessel of memory and milk. She had ceased measuring herself by old standards. She measured instead in warmth, in the rise of her daughter's chest when sleeping, in the calm that settled across Lynette's brow after a long cry. Still, even in the quiet sanctuary of motherhood, the world pressed on. The village, wrapped so long in winter's hush, began to murmur again. Plans for planting were whispered over stews. Livestock pens were checked for damage from the snow. Children were seen more often outdoors, their laughter returning like the first crocus buds beneath the hedge. Ailith watched from the window, Lynette in her arms, and felt the pull of spring not just in the earth, but in herself. She began to open the shutters earlier in the day, letting the wind sweep through the cottage, even if it carried chill. "Let the air move things," her mother said. "It wakes the soul." One morning, Ailith carried Lynette into the garden and stood by the bare elder tree. The ground was still firm with cold, but green peeked from beneath last season's mulch. Snowdrops clustered near the base, their white heads nodding in the breeze. She knelt and showed the flowers to Lynette, pressing the child's hand gently to the leaves. The baby blinked, then smiled, and Ailith felt the season shift again, not on the calendar, but in her heart. With the change came new customs. Ailith began airing linens, hanging them on wooden poles near the orchard, letting the wind and sunlight bleach and soften them. She and the women prepared the first of the spring teas, nettle and lemon balm, gathered and dried from the year before, meant to rouse the blood and ease the tiredness that lingered after long cold months. She also began to prepare for Lynette's first spring blessing. It was not a grand event, not a church feast or a crowded celebration, but a quiet ritual held among women. A time to place the child upon the grass for the first time, to let the earth touch her bare feet, to whisper a prayer for health and growth as the land woke once more. The other mothers shared their own memories. One had buried a lock of her child's hair beneath the first blooming hawthorn. Another had sewn a charm into the hem of her babe's shift. Rosemary for protection, thyme for strength. Ailith listened and considered what she might do. That night she sat by the fire and stitched a small token, a circle of cloth no bigger than her palm, filled with dried sage and a pinch of salt, sewn tight with red thread. She tucked it into Lynette's cradle beneath the pillow, a silent offering. Not for luck, exactly, but for anchoring. A way to remind herself that she could protect her daughter with care, with presence, with the things passed to her by women who had mothered before. Lynette's hair was longer now, fine and dark, soft as down. Her legs kicked with more force, and her laughter, the first true laugh, came one afternoon as Alice mimicked the sound of geese. It startled her, that laugh. Bright and sudden, it rang through the cottage like a chime, drawing every woman's gaze. Alice laughed too, tears stinging her eyes. For all the trials of the sleepless nights, the teething to come, the frets of fever and worry, in that moment there was nothing but joy. A joy not loud, not fleeting, but whole. It curled beneath her ribs, warm as the sun just beginning to wake the soil. Spring was not yet fully here, but in the cradle, in the laughter, in the green tip of snowdrops, it had begun. By mid-March, the earth had softened enough for bare footprints to press into the garden paths, and the first true rain came. Not sleet, not frost, but a slow soaking drizzle that lingered through the morning and made everything smell of earth and moss and newness. The sound of it was steady, like someone whispering across the thatch roof, and inside Alice hummed softly to match its rhythm as she cradled Lynette, now 4 months old and growing more alert with each passing day. The child had begun to laugh more often now, not just in surprise, but with recognition. She laughed at the glint of a spoon catching firelight, at the rustling of leaves outside, and especially at her mother's voice, which she followed like a songbird might follow the wind. Alice had grown used to speaking even when there was no one to answer her, narrating her movements to Lynette as though the baby already understood. We will stir the broth now, slowly, slowly, and here come the peas, fat and sweet from last autumn's store. Her voice filled the room not as chatter, but as a kind of balm, something to steady them both in the ebb and flow of long days. With the turning of the season, new patterns emerged. The cradle that once sat close by the hearth was now moved toward the window during the day, where Lynette could see the shifting light. Alice placed a small mirror beside it, its polished surface made from burnished tin, and Lynette would gaze into it for long minutes, cooing at her reflection, waving her arms as if greeting an old friend. Cloth dolls were made from scraps of wool and linen, stuffed with dried rosemary and thyme. The herbs served a double purpose. They were soft and fragrant, and they masked the inevitable odours of milk, spit, and damp cloth that followed any child so young. Lynette chewed on them as her gums began to swell, the first signs of teething, and the scent of crushed rosemary often lingered on her hands long after. Outside, the village was waking in earnest. Smoke once again curled from every chimney, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed faintly across the fields as repairs were made to barns and fences, weathered by snow. Alice watched from the doorway with Lynette pressed against her chest, both wrapped tightly in a woolen shawl. She didn't yet take the child far, the wind still carried a chill, but short steps along the garden wall helped settle Lynette's restlessness and gave Alice a moment to breathe in the sky, which now stretched wider and bluer by the day. Her days were busy, but not frantic. There was still a slowness to the hours, a rhythm held together by feedings, changings, the tending of fire, the folding of clothes. Yet underneath a quiet momentum had begun, like a river still beneath ice preparing to run. One morning her cousin Rylene visited, her hands red from scrubbing and her apron streaked with flour. She brought a small bundle wrapped in muslin, a sweet pudding made from oats, honey and crushed dried apples. "For strength," she said, placing it on the table, "and because I remember how tired I was when my second was teething." They spoke as they worked, peeling root vegetables for supper, Lynette nearby on a quilt, gurgling between small cries. Rylene told her stories, not of joy or beauty, but of the hard moments, when her first had fallen ill and refused to feed, when she had spent 3 days awake from worry, when she had hidden in the barn to cry so no one would see. Alice listened, heart open, and nodded not in pity, but in recognition. There was comfort in the sharing. Later, when Rylene had gone, Alice sat with Lynette as twilight deepened and shadows rose. She fed her slowly, feeling the warm weight of her daughter's body curled into her arms, and whispered promises not out loud, but from the quiet centre of her being. "I will be here. I will keep you." Not all days were easy. Lynette had begun to fight sleep now, turning her head away from the breast, wailing in a sharp, sudden voice that startled even herself. Alis soothed her with patience, rocking in the old birthing chair that creaked with every motion. She would hum old hymns, not those from the chapel, but those the midwives had sung while preparing linen, songs with no words, only tone and rhythm woven through generations. She discovered too that Lynette now wanted to sit upright, protesting when laid flat. With careful hands, Alis fashioned a bolster from rolled cloth and set it behind the child during waking hours. From this new vantage point, Lynette looked out with wonder, watching the flicker of the fire, the sweep of a broom, the play of dust in sunlight. "She sees now," her mother said one evening, placing a gentle hand on Lynette's chest. "Not just with her eyes, but with her spirit. She is waking to the world." Alis believed it. She could feel the change in the air and in the child, that curious widening of the self, when the soul begins to reach outward to gather and name. She began to prepare for the blessing day. It would be quiet, held among a circle of women. A patch of early grass had already begun to green near the elder tree. That was where the prayer would be whispered. No grand altar, only the earth, the sun, and the arms of the mother. Alis sewed a new shift for Lynette, white linen edged with blue thread. She added a tiny flower motif near the hem, just visible to the eye, stitched with reverent care. Soon, the child would touch the soil for the first time. But for now, Alis held her close, breathing in her warmth, and listened to the rain again, steady and unhurried, falling on the roof as dusk folded gently over the world. The earth had softened beneath the foot, the scent of thaw and old leaves rising with each step taken across the garden path. The frost had retreated to the shade of stone fences and forest hollows, and the air now bore a trace of green, not yet visible to the eye, but known in the bones. Spring had not only come, it had begun to settle. On the morning of Lynette's first blessing, the sun rose behind a thin veil of cloud, its light diffused and gentle, as though the sky itself was whispering instead of shouting. There was no need for grandeur. Alis had not prepared garlands or gathered a crowd. This was not a festival or a feast. It was a moment, quiet and inward, a gift to the child and a promise to the earth. She dressed Lynette in the shift she had sewn, white linen with blue thread, still stiff with newness but soft where it touched the skin. The flower motif stitched near the hem was no more than a few simple loops, but it carried weight, a sign that love had been worked into every seam. The women gathered just after sunrise, only 4, Alis, her mother, Isabel the midwife, and her cousin Rylene. No men were present, not because they were unwelcome, but because this was a rite held by women, passed from cradle to cradle. They walked to the elder tree at the edge of the garden, where the ground rose slightly and caught the first warmth of morning. Beneath the tree, the earth was dry enough to kneel upon, and small shoots of chickweed were already unfolding from the soil. Alis held Lynette close to her chest at first, wrapped in wool. The child stirred, but did not cry, her eyes fluttering in the morning light. Then, when all was still, Alis lowered her daughter slowly, carefully, until the child's bare feet touched the earth. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. The blessing was not spoken loudly. It came as a murmur from 4 voices at once, old words, some of them nearly lost to time, stitched together with breath and memory. The language was a mixture of Latin and something older, the tongue of forest dwellers and shepherds, of grandmothers who had whispered prayers to the moon. No one remembered who had first spoken it. It didn't matter. Earth receive her, sky behold her, fire warm her, water know her name. That was all. Afterward, Alis lifted Lynette again, kissed her brow and wrapped her tightly. The child's feet were cold, but her skin was pink with life. She blinked slowly and yawned, then tucked herself back against her mother's collarbone as though the moment had tired her. They returned to the house quietly. There was no feast, but a warm pot of milk was shared, flavoured with cinnamon and nettle, poured into earthen cups and passed hand to hand. Lynette slept through it all, her breath steady, her limbs twitching now and then with the dreams of early infancy. Alis sat near the fire and watched the steam rise from her cup, and for the first time in many weeks, she felt something loosen inside her. Not the grief of birth, nor the ache of healing, but a readiness, a sense that she was not just surviving now, but stepping into something fuller. The The days that followed were slow and tender. Lynette grew more curious. She rolled onto her side during rest, pulled her hands toward her mouth with greater coordination, and made long strings of sound that filled the cottage with song-like babble. Alis responded in kind, speaking to her as one would to a trusted friend. "Yes, I see you. And tell me more, little bird." The bond between them had deepened into something beyond need. It had become its own language, one of breath, of rhythm, of knowing glances and shared stillness. Outside, the orchard began to swell with green. Buds formed on the apple trees, and wild mustard sprouted along the ditch. Alis began to walk with Lynette further each day, first to the garden wall, then to the edge of the lane, then into the field, where sheep grazed. She carried her in a sling made of woven cloth, her hands always free, but her attention always tethered to the child tucked against her breast. The villagers grew more familiar again. No longer did they ask questions about the child's father. It seemed the seasons themselves had moved their minds elsewhere, and Lynette's laughter softened even the hardest faces. The old woman who lived by the mill offered Alis a sprig of rosemary one afternoon, pressing it into her hand. "For her bath," she said. "It brings calm to the skin." Alis took it and thanked her, adding it to the small pot she steeped each evening. Rosemary, lavender, marigold. The scent filled the air as she washed Lynette in a shallow basin near the fire. The child kicked and splashed now, arms flailing joyfully, and Alis laughed with her, the sound of it rising like smoke into the beams above. One night, as the moon waxed full, Alis stepped outside with Lynette asleep against her chest. The sky was wide and strewn with stars. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once and was silent. She stood beneath the same elder tree and closed her eyes. "I will raise you in the turning of the seasons," she whispered. "I will teach you the names of wind and water. I will show you the quiet strength of soil." Lynette stirred in her sleep, her fingers curling slightly. Alis breathed deep, drawing in the scent of spring, of damp wood, of new grass and night air. She felt the world shift beneath her feet, and this time she did not brace against it. She let it carry her, let it move her gently forward, let it fold her into the long, slow rhythm of motherhood, of earth, of time. And from within the folds of her shawl, Lynette breathed with her in perfect tender harmony. The days lengthened slowly and sweetly, like the unwinding of a spool. Sunlight lingered longer on the stone walls, and the shadows in the garden stretched toward evening like yawns. The earth softened entirely now, the kind of soft that welcomed bare feet, that crumbled easily in the hand, that smelled of promise and deep roots stirring beneath. Lynette had passed her 5th month and begun to sit with support, her back straight as a reed, her eyes alight with an almost solemn curiosity. She no longer simply looked, she studied. Her hands reached with intention now, grasping for wooden spoons, scraps of cloth, her mother's hair, and the worn hem of the shawl Alis always wore in the mornings. She was learning the shape of the world, one thread at a time. Alis watched with a quiet pride. Her own hands were busier these days. Spring's arrival brought with it the return of tasks too long set aside. The turning of soil, the planting of early greens, the weaving of baskets from last year's rushes. She worked steadily, Lynette always near. Sometimes the child lay on a quilt beneath the budding apple trees, babbling into the breeze. Other times she slept in the sling against Alis's chest, her breath rising and falling in tandem with her mother's steps. There was a rhythm now to each day, not imposed but grown, like ivy on old stone, slow and sure. Mornings began with feeding and fire tending. Alis stirred the ashes, added kindling, boiled water for tea, and prepared porridge flecked with bits of dried plum. Lynette, now tasting soft food for the first time, took her share in tiny spoonfuls, often more on her chin than in her mouth. Still, she opened her lips eagerly each time, her face lit with the delight of something new. After breakfast came time in the garden. Alis worked while Lynette watched from a shaded patch of blanket, her hands clutching at small wooden toys carved by her cousin, animals with rounded edges and smooth backs. Sometimes Alis would pause to hold her, lifting her up to show her the budding leaves, to name aloud each flower, each bird call, each shift of wind. "These are violets," she would say. "They come early, just like you did." One afternoon, while digging near the elder tree, Alis unearthed an old spoon, bent, its bowl blackened with age. She held it in her palm and wondered whose hands had once stirred soup with it, whose lips it had touched. She placed it on the stone wall and left it there, not as a relic, but as an offering to the unnamed past. The women of the village had returned to their gathering ways. With the earth softened, herbs were sought once more. Chickweed, dandelion, wild garlic. Alice joined them when she could, Lynette strapped securely against her back. The child loved the motion, the swaying, the jostle of steps, the scent of crushed greenery all around. In these gatherings, stories were passed again. Some of planting, some of dreams, some of long-ago births and quiet deaths. The women told them without ceremony, as they always had, woven into the picking of nettles and the peeling of bark. Alice listened, and sometimes now she shared her own. Of Lynette's first laugh, of the night she sang beneath the stars, of the fevered cry that stilled when nothing else would. No one questioned her now, not about the child's father, not about her solitude. It was understood. Alice was a mother, and that alone spoke all the truth anyone needed. The priest visited once, bringing with him a blessing for the new season. He greeted Lynette with a smile, his fingers rough but kind, as he traced a small cross upon her brow. "A bright one," he said softly. "She listens more than most." Alice nodded but did not speak. She knew her daughter's gaze held a depth rarely found in one so small. At night, Lynette grew restless again, not in pain, not sick, simply awake, as though the growing light had stirred her from the deep slumber of winter. Alice adjusted, rising more often, feeding by candlelight, walking with slow steps around the cottage as the stars wheeled overhead. She began singing again in earnest, lullabies passed down through her mother's voice, songs sung in kitchens and gardens and fields. One spoke of a lark that nested in a child's cradle. Another told of a mother who dreamed of waves while rocking her babe to sleep. They had no written form, no known author. They were carried, like seeds, from voice to voice across centuries. Sometimes Alice made up her own. "Sleep now, little branch," she whispered once, cradling Lynette in the deepest hour of night. "The moon will keep your dreams from drifting." With spring in full sway, the cottage grew brighter. A curtain was washed and rehung, the hearthstones scrubbed with lemon balm and vinegar. Fresh rushes were laid on the floor, mixed with mint and dried heather. Alice cut her hair shorter, tying it with a strip of linen. Lynette's cradle was moved to face the window, where she could see the birds pass. The baby smiled more now, laughed daily, and reached for her mother with both arms, her voice rising in delight when Alice leaned close. And with each day, Alice felt herself settle more deeply into this new life. It was not always easy, not always soft, but it was real and steady, and wrapped in the kind of love that needed no fanfare. Just breath and bread and light, and a child, sleeping in the sun. The days of May drifted in on warm breezes, soft and drowsy, like pages turning themselves. Bees returned in quiet chorus to the garden's edge, darting through the blooming heads of clover and the first open cups of the daisies. The apple trees, now in full blossom, shed their petals slowly so that the yard looked as if snow had fallen again, a gentler snow, fragrant and pale pink. Lynette was 6 months old. She sat unassisted now for long stretches, her back straight, her chin lifted as she took in the world like a tiny queen surveying a kingdom of woven grass and firelight. Her laughter was quick, sudden, bursting forth in bright syllables that made even the hens cluck in response. She loved to be held, facing outward, her legs kicking as if marching, her hands outstretched toward anything that moved, leaves, lace curtains, the flicker of her mother's fingers in the loom. Alice, in turn, had found herself changed again. She no longer woke in a fog of fatigue. Her body, long adapted to the rhythm of broken sleep, now seemed to gather strength from smaller things. A nap taken with Lynette curled beside her, a spoon of warm honey steeped in lemon balm tea, the weight of her daughter's head resting on her shoulder at dusk. It was not the old energy, the lightness of her maiden years, but something deeper, steadier, drawn from roots that had grown in silence. Their days were long, but full. In the mornings, Alice rose before Lynette stirred and gathered herbs from the garden while dew still clung to their stems. She harvested chives, violets and mint, wrapping them in linen and tucking them into clay jars. Lynette, upon waking, was greeted with a quiet song and a warm cloth passed gently over her face, a ritual that always brought a smile. They ate together on the floor. Alice with a wooden bowl of oats, Lynette with mashed lentils or soft pear pressed through a sieve. The child now opened her mouth with eager delight, flapping her hands at the sight of the spoon. There were small messes, of course, smears of fruit on cheeks, bits of broth in her hair, but Alice did not mind. Cleanliness was never more important than joy. Midday was reserved for the garden. Lynette, settled on a thick quilt, was content to watch birds flutter past or the spinning of laundry in the breeze. Alice worked nearby, staking beans, mending a fence, turning soil with a wooden spade. The sun warmed her back, the scent of lavender and old straw curling in the air. Neighbours passed often now. The days of isolation were long gone. Women stopped to chat, to bring news, or to offer help with planting. Some came with their own children, and Lynette watched them with wide eyes. She had not yet played with others, but she studied them intently. Their loud voices, their quick steps, the way they fell and rose like wildflowers in wind. Rylene came regularly, bringing cheese, news from the far side of the village, and laughter. She carried her youngest on her hip and often sat with Alice in the shade, the two of them talking as they worked flax or shucked peas. They spoke of small things, of teething, of dreams, of bread that would not rise. But under it all was the quiet sharing of lives deeply lived, if not loudly. One morning, Lynette's first tooth emerged. Alice noticed it while bathing her daughter in the basin near the hearth. As she rubbed water behind the child's ears, Lynette leaned forward to bite at her mother's finger, and there it was, a small ridge of white on the lower gum, just sharp enough to feel. Alice laughed aloud, the sound echoing through the cottage. She marked the moment without ceremony, no charm, no ribbon, only the whisper of, "Well done, little one," and a kiss pressed to the baby's damp brow. That evening, when her mother visited, she held Lynette close and murmured a blessing beneath her breath, tracing a circle on the child's chest. A gesture more ancient than words, older than the chapel, passed from hand to hand through women who knew the cost and beauty of growth. With her new tooth, Lynette began to explore food with greater interest. She chewed on bits of soft bread crust, pressed pieces of carrot to her lips, and giggled when the food fell from her fingers before reaching her mouth. Each bite was an adventure, each meal a lesson in patience and wonder. As the sun slipped lower each evening, Alice returned to the rhythm of lullabies. Now, Lynette joined in, not with words, but with hums, with breathy sounds that mimicked melody. Her head would rest against her mother's collarbone, her body warm from a fresh cloth and a full belly, her fingers curled into the edge of Alice's shawl. On one such evening, with the wind brushing softly through the open window and the fire burning low, Alice spoke aloud words she had not yet dared. "Soon you'll crawl." The thought startled her. It meant change. Again, movement, distance, the slow unthreading of the quiet swaddled bond they had known these past months. But it also meant growth, strength, a new chapter. Alice would meet it, as she had met all the others, with both hands open and a heart prepared for whatever might come. Outside, the apple petals continued to fall, covering the ground in pink-white snow. And inside the cottage, the cradle sat still for now, but not for long. The child who once lay within it would soon begin to move, slowly, steadily, across the woven rushes of the floor, toward a world that waited just beyond the threshold of her mother's arms. The wind of early June swept gently through the orchard, rustling the leaves with the soft murmur of a lullaby remembered. The sun had grown stronger now, casting its gold across the fields in long, warm strokes. Bees danced in and out of the hedgerows, their hum deepening with purpose. In the cottages and gardens of the village, life quickened to meet the season. Lynette, now just past 6 moons, had begun to shift. It started with the smallest of movements, a roll from back to side, then side to belly. Her arms, once flailing, now pushed against the floor with determination. Her legs curled beneath her, testing the strength that had been slowly gathering. Each motion was a question her body asked of itself. Can I reach? Can I lift? And with each answer, she moved a little more boldly. Alice watched these small triumphs with a quiet reverence. She did not hurry her daughter along. There were no marks to meet, no pressure to perform, only the natural unfolding of strength, like buds coaxed by the sun. She padded the floor near the hearth with quilts and laid out small objects for Lynette to reach. Wooden rings, a piece of smooth coral, a scrap of linen embroidered with stars. Lynette reached, and sometimes she succeeded. Other times she wailed in frustration, her brow furrowed with effort. But she kept trying, always trying. With movement came the need for vigilance. Alice found herself scanning the floor more carefully now for small crumbs, loose threads, anything that might find its way into Lynette's curious mouth. She kept the hearth guard up at all times, even when the fire was low, and began placing sprigs of lavender and chamomile in small cloth pouches, sewing them to the corners of Lynette's blanket. Calming herbs, familiar scents. In these days of watching and guiding, Alice noticed something more. Lynette had begun to search for her, not just with the eyes, but with intent. If Alice left the room, even for a moment, the child turned her head sharply. If she returned, Lynette's face would brighten like dawn, arms flapping with glee. This recognition was new. A bridge not of need, but of knowing. "You are my centre," her Highness would say, "and when you return, the world steadies again." It humbled Alice, this depth of trust, and it deepened her own sense of self in ways she had not expected. She had long known the labour of motherhood, the feeding, the changing, the rocking, the cleaning, but now she began to understand its gravity, the way her presence was not just comfort, but compass. She took joy in the details, the way Lynette curled her toes when placed on the grass, how her fingers explored her own ears as if discovering treasure, how she preferred the sound of water over any lullaby, a stream, a bucket poured, rain against the roof. These were the beginnings of a person, a soul opening like a flower, petal by petal. By midsummer, the garden had grown dense and green, broad beans swelled on their stalks, and calendula bloomed in bright, stubborn bursts. Alice often worked with Lynette on her back, wrapped in a sling of soft woven wool dyed with walnut hulls. The baby's head rested against her shoulder, eyes blinking slowly at the sway of trees and the rhythm of the scythe. Together they moved through the days. Neighbours stopped more often now, drawn by the openness of Alice's yard, by the scent of herbs drying on twine, by the simple peace that seemed to live in her space. They brought gifts, bundles of wild garlic, dried fish, a carved spoon, and in return, Alice offered a place to sit, a warm drink, and the steady babble of Lynette's voice. The village children had taken to visiting too, curious about the baby. They knelt beside her blanket, offering pebbles and blades of grass, singing nonsense songs to make her laugh. Lynette adored them, reaching for their faces, squealing with delight when they clapped or danced. She was learning already the joy of others. In the evenings after supper and stories, Alice would bathe her daughter in the old copper basin near the hearth. The water was steeped with marjoram and sweet flag, the scent rising like mist as she poured it gently over Lynette's skin. The baby kicked and splashed, mouth wide with wonder. Alice dried her with linen and wrapped her in a woolen robe stitched with a crescent moon. Then came quiet. Lynette would nurse, growing heavier with sleep, her hands curling into fists near her chin. Alice would hum as the fire burned low, watching the child's breathing slow, the flicker of the flames mirrored in her dark lashes. She often lingered in that stillness, even after Lynette had gone quiet, holding her not out of duty but devotion. It was in those moments she felt the thread of time most clearly, the way this part of her life, this season of slow days and small miracles, would one day become memory, not blurred but golden, suspended like dust in sunlight. And so she memorized it, the weight of Lynette in her arms, the sound of wind through open shutters, the scent of chamomile and wood smoke, for the child would soon crawl, and the world once so small would begin to open wide. The summer settled in with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Days began early, pale gold creeping beneath the door and warming the rush-strewn floors before the fire was lit. Evenings stretched long, light clinging to the sky until well after the last bowl had been scrubbed and the hens had gone quiet in their roosts. It was a season of fullness, full baskets, full blossoms, full hearts. And Lynette was on the move. It began subtly, a reach just a little farther, a twist, a scoot. Then one afternoon, with her mother kneeling nearby in the garden, Lynette planted her palms against the quilt and pushed forward. Not far, not fast, but with purpose. Alice watched, stunned, her hands still dusty with soil. Lynette paused, panting slightly with the effort, then pushed forward again. The movement wasn't graceful, more a shuffle than a crawl, but it was undeniable. She had begun. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Alice sat in the quiet of the house, holding Lynette close, the child's head pressed to her collarbone. The moment had made her chest ache, not with worry nor regret, but with that bittersweet blend of pride and parting. Lynette's world had shifted. She would no longer be just a held thing. She was becoming a seeker. And seekers, Alice knew, always found the edges. In the days that followed, the cottage was gently rearranged. The hearth was shielded with a higher guard. The heavy pots were moved from low shelves. The chest of dried herbs, once left slightly ajar for ease, was now latched with a bit of woven twine. Lynette explored everything. The texture of straw, the shimmer of sunlight on floorboards, the feel of cool stone beneath her hands. She was cautious at first, then bold. And when she fell, as all little ones do, it was rarely with tears. She simply rolled back, blinked, and tried again. The women who visited marvelled at her strength. "She'll walk before the leaves fall," that one of them said, lifting Lynette's hand and feeling the weight in her grasp. Alice only smiled. She had no wish to rush the seasons. But it was true. Lynette was quickening. Her body had lengthened. Her eyes were sharper, following motion with focus. She had begun to babble in earnest, stringing together sounds that bore the cadence of language. Alice answered every utterance. She did not correct, did not instruct, only mirrored and offered back her own voice in rhythm and tone. "It is like two birds calling," her mother said once, listening to them speak. "You echo each other until it becomes song." And so it did. They sang their days in wordless dialogue and familiar phrases. Alice found herself speaking aloud more than ever before, not just to Lynette, but to the tasks at hand. She narrated her cooking, her sweeping, her weaving. It was not to teach, but to include, to say, "You are part of this, little one. You are already woven in." The village had grown more animated in the height of summer. The fields were alive with motion, and the riverbank became a gathering place in the hottest afternoons. Alice took Lynette there once, carried in a sling over her back, her legs strong enough now to hold the child for longer walks. At the river, the other mothers laid quilts beneath the trees. Children ran barefoot, splashing at the water's edge. Alice sat with her feet in the stream while Lynette sat beside her, wide-eyed at the play of light on water. A boy of 3 brought her a snail shell, offering it with solemn pride. Lynette took it in her hands, turned it, and laughed. And for a moment, Alice felt herself not alone, not in struggle, not in wonder. All around her were women in the same quiet labour, the same tender witness to growing life. The afternoon passed in soft brightness. When they returned home, Lynette napped deeply, her limbs slack, her breath slow. Alice too rested. Not from exhaustion, but from fullness. That night the wind changed. It swept through the shutters in long, warm gusts, carrying the scent of dry earth and elder blossom. A storm would come, perhaps not now, but soon. The sky had that feeling, thick with potential, a quiet charge beneath the stars. Alice did not fear it. She had weathered storms before, some of wind, some of the soul. She banked the fire, checked the latches on the windows, and returned to Lynette's side. The child stirred, then sighed, one hand resting open against her mother's palm. There were no words for the way time moved now, not fast, not slow, only forward. Carried on the backs of small movements and soft songs, on herbs gathered and teeth cut, on first steps and steady arms. Outside, the first few raindrops began to fall. Inside, the cradle, still there, still used, rocked gently on its own, empty for the moment, but never forgotten. It would not be long before Lynette walked. But for now, she slept. And her mother, watching her through the hush of summer rain, understood that love is often quiet and always steady, like footsteps just before they begin. The storm arrived not with violence, but with slow insistence. A deepening of sky, a murmuring wind, the gentle thrum of raindrops upon the roof. It swept through the village like a long exhale, soaking the thirsty fields, washing the dust from the leaves, and gathering in quiet pools along the stone path outside the cottage. Within, the world turned inward once more. Lynette, nearing the cusp of her 7th moon, had become more than a babe in arms. She crawled now with purpose, swift across the rushes, drawn to light, to sound, to the shimmer of brass and the softness of wool. Her hands left trails on the dew-slick window panes, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the rain. She had begun to stand too, not yet on her own, but pulling herself upright with the help of table legs and bench corners, her small feet planted wide, her fingers gripping with fierce determination. Each attempt was met with quiet applause, not from strangers or onlookers, but from Alice, who watched with eyes that held pride and something deeper, that aching tenderness known only to those who have kept long vigils at the threshold of change. The cradle sat mostly unused now. Lynette preferred the floor, the quilt, the open spaces where she could explore and unfold. Alice did not mourn the change. She had loved the stillness, the close mornings, the curled weight of her child asleep beside her. But she welcomed this new chapter too. One of movement, of discovery, of little feet learning the ground. The cottage shifted to accommodate. Sharp corners were padded with linen. The tools once kept within reach were now lifted higher. A line of dried lavender, once hung low for easy scenting, was moved beyond Lynette's eager grasp. Her curiosity knew no boundaries. She pressed her fingers into flour, into mud, into the curls of the cat who visited from time to time and now retreated to the loft beams. Still, even with this newfound energy, Lynette clung tightly when tired. In the lull of afternoon, she would crawl to Alice, lift her arms in quiet plea and nestle into her mother's neck, her breath warm and shallow. Alice would wrap them both in the woven shawl and they would rock in the birthing chair, the rain a gentle percussion on the roof above. Outside, the garden flourished. The beans climbed their trellises, heavy with green pods. Calendula opened with the morning sun and closed again in the hush of dusk. Chickens scratched in the moist soil and the hedges, thick with growth, whispered in the breeze. Alice gathered each day, sage for drying, thyme for stews, petals to steep in oil for salves. Lynette sat beside her in the grass, tasting clover, reaching for dandelion seeds floating by. Neighbours passed again more frequently now, offering plums, bundles of nettle, a handful of wild strawberries. With each visitor came a story, and Alice received them all. She had become a keeper of quiet spaces, a place where others could rest, sip warm milk, and speak of their own children, their own shifts and seasons. And in return she asked only for time to watch her daughter grow, time to plant and to gather, to rest and to sing. One twilight after the storm had passed, Alice carried Lynette to the elder tree. The leaves shimmered with water, each droplet catching the last gold of the setting sun. She placed the child at the base, letting her feel the grass with bare feet, letting her sway with the wind. "You were blessed here," she whispered. "Do you remember?" Lynette did not understand the words, but she looked up, eyes wide, as a single petal, late to fall, drifted down and settled on her arm. A soft noise escaped her lips, not a laugh, not a cry, but something in between, a song of wonder. That night, Alice lay awake long after the child had fallen asleep. The fire had died low, the room was dim, and yet she felt no fear, no sadness, only the awareness of passage, the recognition that time was not a straight path but a circle, that each moment folded into the next, layering love upon love, memory upon memory. She reached out and brushed Lynette's hair from her brow, the strands fine and damp with sleep. "You are growing," she murmured, "and I am growing too." The storm had passed, the ground was clean, and outside the window the moon rose full and round, watching over the quiet house with its cradle, its mother and its child who would soon walk out into a world softened by rain and made ready by love. The moon waned and the warm breath of summer deepened. The grasses grew taller, bowing gently beneath their own weight, and swallows darted low through the dusky air. The scent of chamomile was thick near the garden's edge, where bees pressed heavily into the yellow hearts of each bloom, and the ground held the memory of rain, soft, spongy, and full of life. Lynette was nearly 8 moons old, and she had begun to stand. No longer content to merely pull herself upright, she now held her balance for several breaths at a time, her arms raised like branches in the wind, her legs wobbling beneath her but strong with new determination. Alice watched these moments with quiet awe, never rushing, never coaxing. Lynette's steps would come when they were ready and not a day before. And still, the floor remained her kingdom. She crawled from hearth to doorway, from blanket to bench, her palms dark with earth, her laughter echoing through the cottage like bird call. She chased shadows, reached for sunbeams, and clutched at the hems of skirts as they passed. Ailís often wore a length of cloth at her waist now, tied and looped, not only to keep her hands free, but to lift Lynette quickly when she reached for her. Meals became more playful. Lynette had discovered the joy of sound, not only in her voice, but in the tapping of wooden spoons, the squish of soft fruit between fingers, the ringing clang of a dropped cup. Ailís let her explore. Food was not simply nourishment now. It was texture, colour, sensation. She prepared thick porridges flecked with herbs, mashed beans with garlic, softened apples with cloves, and watched Lynette discover each with wonder and sometimes indignation. And while the child learned the world, Ailís tended to the rhythm of home. She patched linens worn thin with use, replaced broken hinges with leather ties, and set bundles of wool to soak in vats of nettle dye. The house smelled often of soapwort and steam, and her hands grew red and dry with washing, but she found satisfaction in the quiet cycle. Use, mend, use again. Nothing wasted, nothing hurried. On the feast day of St. Walpurga, the village gathered beneath the chapel hill. It was one of the softer festivals. No dancing, no fire jumping, only quiet prayers and the sharing of herbs. The women came with baskets of plantain, yarrow, motherwort and mint. They exchanged cuttings, whispered remedies, and tied green bundles above the chapel door to guard against sickness and misfortune. Ailís brought Lynette swaddled to her hip, a wreath of sweet woodruff circling the child's head. The other women smiled and nodded as they passed, some reaching to touch Lynette's toes, others murmuring blessings under their breath. Ailís stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the priest offered his incantation, the smoke of burning sage rising into the warm sky. When it was done, she returned home with her own bundle of herbs, now tied with red thread. That evening, she hung it in the rafters above Lynette's cradle, the scent mingling with the lavender already drying there. The season was ripening. The blackberries along the path had begun to blush. Ailís walked with Lynette in the cooler hours, following the edge of the forest where the light fell through branches in dapples and gold. She showed her daughter the trees by name: alder, birch, ash. She pressed the child's hand to bark, to leaf, to moss, and whispered, "This is yours too." And Lynette, eyes wide, reached without hesitation. She was changing in other ways. Her babble had taken on new shape, a rhythm more like words, though none had yet formed in full. Ailís answered each sound with her own, and together they conversed in a language understood only by the two of them, a language of touch, breath, repetition. "Bah!" Lynette would say, pointing to the bread. "Bah!" Ailís would echo, smiling. "Yes, bread." There were moments now when Ailís caught glimpses of the girl Lynette would become, not just the baby she had been. A tilt of the head, a sudden expression of mischief, the deep and searching look in her eyes. It stirred something within her, a mix of joy and melancholy, as though she were already mourning the passing of a chapter, even as it unfolded. At night, Lynette slept more soundly, her body curled like a question mark, her breaths long and even. Ailís sometimes lay beside her, not out of need, but simply to listen, to memorise the rise and fall of her chest, the tiny squeaks that accompanied dreams, the way her fingers still twitched, even in rest. One evening, as a warm breeze crept in through the shuttered window, Ailís whispered a story, not from memory but from instinct, a tale of a woman who planted wishes in the ground like seeds, and a child who gathered them with open hands. Her voice was low, her cadence steady, and though Lynette was already asleep, Ailís continued until the story came to its end. Then she sat in the hush, watching the last light fade from the wall. The days were long now, but she could feel the tipping point ahead. The wheat would soon turn gold, the wind would shift, and Lynette, this child of summer, would take her first steps into a world not only prepared for her, but already listening. The wheat had begun to whisper. It rustled low and golden beneath the high sun, the stalks leaning together in murmured conversation, heads heavy with grain. The whole of the village seemed to slow under the weight of ripening, a pause before the gathering, a breath drawn deep and held. Even the birds flew lower now, their wings lazy in the warm air, their songs quieter as though they too were listening. Lynette was 10 moons old, and the world no longer came to her. She went to it. Her legs had grown strong, her balance sure. She no longer crawled but walked, haltingly at first, then with more assurance each day. At first it was a few paces from hearth to bench, then from bench to doorway, then across the rushes in pursuit of a cat that had no intention of being caught. She walked with hands half raised, as though navigating some invisible tide, and her steps made no sound at all but the faint rustle of cloth. Ailís did not weep when she saw those first true steps. She smiled softly and pressed her hand to her chest, where the ache of pride met the pulse of letting go. For this was not sorrow, this was growth, holy and whole. The cottage changed again. Furniture shifted to the edges, herbs were hung higher, a low stool became Lynette's table, where she could sit upon folded wool and poke curiously at bits of softened carrot or crumbled cheese between her fingers. Ailís made her a small cup from fired clay, just her size, shaped with the print of a mother's thumb, and drank from it clumsily, half spilling, half laughing. The days unfolded in their long rhythm, steady and sun-drenched. Each morning, the shutters were thrown wide. The light spilled in thick and golden, warming the stone floor and the old wooden beams. Ailís would sweep the rushes, shake the linens and sing as she worked, her voice untrained but true. Lynette followed her, toddling from task to task, her hands grasping for broom, for apron string, for the hem of her mother's gown. They gardened in the soft hours before the sun reached its height. Lynette sat with a basket, placing beans inside, one by one, only to dump them out again with glee. She had found delight in order and in undoing, stacking stones just to watch them fall, pulling threads from cloth, unravelling the edges of a woven mat with patient precision. Ailís let her. These were her lessons. Afternoons were slower, shaded. Lynette often napped upon a folded quilt beneath the open window, the sound of bees and the smell of marigold drifting in with the breeze. Ailís would sit beside her with mending in hand, or a root to peel, or nothing at all. Sometimes she simply watched, the rise and fall of her daughter's chest, the flicker of her lashes, the way one tiny foot always crept from beneath the blanket, as if testing the air even in sleep. The village, now deep in the preparations of harvest, was noisier, livelier. The men sharpened scythes and repaired carts. The women gathered herbs more quickly, their hands stained with green and sun. Children ran barefoot through the lanes and chickens scattered before them. Songs rose from the fields, work songs passed down through generations, their verses worn smooth by time. And through it all, Lynette walked. She walked to the edge of the garden wall, where wild thyme grew in clumps. She walked to the shallow stream where her mother dipped her feet and showed her how to trace ripples with her fingers. She walked in circles near the elder tree, arms wide, babbling to the sky. She had begun to speak now, not full words, but sounds with shape. Ma was frequent, sometimes joyful, sometimes demanding, always certain. Ba for bird, for bread, for the rhythm of her own feet. Ailís answered each with clarity, naming things gently. This is the sky, that is a stone, here is your name, Lynette. It was in one such moment at the close of day that Lynette said it clearly for the first time. Ninette. Not perfect, not quite formed, but hers. Ailís stilled, the sun at her back, the bowl in her lap forgotten. She looked at her daughter, who stood with a piece of grass in her hand and a look of pure delight. And then she laughed, low and long, the kind of laugh that leaves behind a softness in the ribs. That evening the village gathered again, not for work, but for song. The green in the common had been cleared. A long table was set with bread, fresh cheese, roasted leeks, and cider that shimmered gold in the light of lanterns. It was the gathering before the cutting, a celebration of all that had grown. Ailís brought Lynette wrapped in a shawl, her small feet tucked beneath, her eyes wide in the golden dusk. There was no fanfare, no speech, only music, the hum of fiddle and drum, the rise and fall of voice, the shuffle of feet in slow dance. Lynette clapped her hands, and Ailís, holding her close, knew this moment too would root itself in the heart. A memory stitched into the fabric of a life, a summer's end, a first word, a gathering not only of grain but of grace. The mornings came cooler now, not cold, not yet, but with a certain hush in the air, a stillness that clung to the grass before the sun rose high enough to burn it away. The dew lingered longer, heavy on the leaves, and the smoke from the cottage chimneys curled straighter into the sky. It was the whisper of autumn's arrival, subtle and slow, like the soft pull of a blanket over sleeping shoulders. Lynette had turned one, not in a measured ceremony. There was no marked day with candles or carved cakes. But in the quiet acknowledgement of those around her, the midwife who left a carved spoon by the door, Rylene who brought a honeyed oat loaf, Aelis's mother who wove a tiny cap of wool with walnut husk and marigold flower, and Aelis too had marked it, not with words, but with memory. She had risen early that morning and gone to the elder tree alone. The grass was wet, the air sweet with fog, and she had stood in silence for a time, her hand resting on the rough bark. 1 year, a season of seasons, a circle made whole. She returned to the cottage where Lynette still slept, curled on her side, her mouth parted slightly, one hand tucked beneath her cheek. Aelis watched her for a long moment, then bent to kiss her temple. "Good morning, my girl," she whispered. "You've come so far." And indeed, she had. Lynette now moved with ease through the small spaces of their world. She toddled across the packed earth floor with confidence, barefoot and bold, stopping only to examine a shadow or a beetle or the fall of a stray petal. Her words came slowly, carefully, "Marta, but her meaning was clear. She had a language of gestures now, a lifting of arms, a tilt of the head, a hand placed softly upon Aelis's knee. She was no longer merely growing, she was becoming. Her favourite place of late was the windowsill, a wide wooden ledge beside the hearth where she could kneel and watch the lane. Chickens wandered past. Neighbours with baskets nodded in greeting. Sometimes a dog trotted by, and Lynette would press her hands to the glass, breath fogging the pain in excited puffs. Aelis encouraged her explorations. She let her taste elderberries crushed between clean fingers. She let her dig in the soft soil near the garden wall, her hands blackened to the wrist, her nails full of earth. She bathed her afterward with warm rainwater and lemon balm, and Lynette laughed as the water trickled over her toes. There were moments now when Aelis would leave her daughter with her mother or Rylene for a short while, to fetch supplies, to walk to the woodcutters, to visit the old woman with the spindle and the endless stories. At first it had been hard. The space where Lynette's presence had been so constant, now briefly hollow. But Aelis had come to cherish those interludes, time to breathe, to stretch, to remember herself not just as mother but as woman, and Lynette always greeted her return with joy, arms lifted, face lit with a smile that held no reproach, only welcome. At dusk, as the light turned honey thick and slow, they often sat together on the threshold. Lynette would rest in Aelis's lap, her hair now curling at the edges, damp from a wash, her hands sticky with the last of the pear slices. Together they would watch the sun slip behind the distant ridge, the trees turn from green to gold to shadow, the sky gather stars like seeds scattered across velvet. It was during one such evening that Aelis spoke, not to Lynette but beside her. She told the story of her own mother who had sung to the bread as it rose, of her grandmother who had given birth to her last child alone in a field, then returned home with the babe in one arm and a bundle of wild leeks in the other. Of the women whose names were not written, but whose hands had shaped the world she now passed on. Lynette, too young to understand, turned her face toward the voice, and Aelis kissed her brow. There was peace in these days, not ease, for there was always work, always worry, always the ache of not knowing what tomorrow might bring. But there was peace, threaded through like flax in linen, tight and strong. The village would soon turn toward harvest. The wheat would be cut, the apples stored, the herbs tied in final bunches for winter. Aelis would prepare the hearth for longer nights, bring in the woolens, mend the boots. Lynette would walk more steadily, speak more clearly, begin to climb and question and stretch the world wider with each passing week. But for now the candle flickered gently on the table. The stew simmered low. Lynette dozed against her mother's chest, thumb tucked beneath her chin, the slow warmth of sleep spreading through her limbs, and Aelis, rocking gently, looked into the quiet flame and let the memory of the year settle into her bones. A year of blood, of milk, of firelight. A year of becoming. She did not know what would come next, but she knew this. She had mothered with her whole heart. She had held, fed, soothed, sung. She had planted, healed, protected, and loved. And in the hush of this final summer night, she let that be enough. For now and for always.